A broke single father stops in a rainstorm to help a stranger, never knowing she secretly holds his daughter's life in her hands. Ethan Mercer had never once believed in luck. He believed in calloused hands, double shifts, and the hospital bill he kept folded in his wallet like a punishment he carried everywhere. His 9-year-old daughter Sophie needed open-heart surgery, $94,000 worth of surgery, and every month he fell a little further behind. That night, driving home through a storm that felt almost personal, wipers screaming, shoulders burning from 12 hours on his knees under someone else's HVAC unit, he almost didn't stop. Almost. But there she was, a woman standing alone in the rain, no umbrella, no cab, just the kind of stillness that made him feel like driving past her would be the worst thing he'd ever done. He stopped. That decision, 30 seconds of basic human decency, would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, pride, and what it actually means to save someone. Drop a comment below with the city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The storm came in fast that Tuesday evening, the way summer storms in Millhaven always did. Not gradually, not with any polite warning, just a sudden wall of dark rolling in off the river, and then all at once the sky opened up like it had been holding a grudge for weeks. Ethan Mercer felt it before he saw it. He was still 3 blocks from the parking lot when the first fat drops hit the cracked windshield of his 2009 Ford F-15. Oh, and by the time he climbed in and got the engine running, the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like static, like the whole world had switched channels. He sat there for a minute with the heater blowing cold. It always blew cold for the first 5 minutes, something wrong with the blower motor he hadn't had time to fix. And he pressed his palms flat against his thighs and just breathed. 12 hours. 12 hours crawling through crawl spaces and rooftop units, and one particularly miserable basement job on Crowder Street where the homeowner stood over him the entire time, asking questions Ethan didn't have the patience to answer. The man wanted to know why Ethan wasn't wearing a company uniform. He wanted to know why Ethan's van said Mercer HVAC on the side instead of one of the big outfits. He wanted reassurance, basically, that he wasn't being serviced by someone beneath him. Ethan had fixed his system in 40 minutes, charged him a fair rate, and said very little on the way out. That was Tuesday. Monday had been a commercial job out near the Millhaven Industrial Corridor, a warehouse unit the size of a football field with a compressor that had been dying a slow death for 2 seasons. Sunday had been a call-out. Saturday he'd worked until dark. He couldn't remember what he'd done Friday, which probably meant he'd worked that too. He pulled out of the lot and merged onto Granger Avenue heading east, wipers going full tilt, radio off. He didn't like the radio when he was tired. It felt like someone talking at him. Sophie was at Mrs. Calloway's apartment 2 floors below his. Rita Calloway was 71 years old, a retired school teacher who'd been widowed 6 years ago and who, Ethan suspected, looked after Sophie partly out of genuine affection and partly because it gave her something to do in the evenings other than watch the news and worry. He paid her what he could. She always said it was too much. Neither of them was right. Sophie would be at the kitchen table doing homework, or she'd be on the couch with a book. She went through books faster than Ethan could keep up with, or she'd be watching one of those nature documentaries she'd gotten obsessed with lately. Otters. For about 6 weeks it had been exclusively otters. He didn't understand it, but he liked that she had a thing. He thought about her while he drove. It was how he got through the drives home. He let himself think about her specifically, not about the bills or the surgery or the cardiologist appointments, or the way Dr. Reyes had looked at him 3 weeks ago across that desk in that small beige office and explained with the careful language of someone who'd had this conversation too many times that Sophie's aortic valve was deteriorating faster than they'd initially projected, and that waiting much longer carried risks they really shouldn't accept. "We're looking at a window," Dr. Reyes had said, "not indefinitely open." Ethan had nodded. He'd asked the practical questions, timeline, specific risks, recovery, and he'd written things down in the small notebook he carried because he didn't trust himself to remember details when he was scared. Then he'd driven to the parking garage and sat in his truck for 22 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. $94,000. With his current insurance after the maximum out-of-pocket cap, He was still looking at somewhere between $18,000 and $23,000, depending on which billing code they used, which was its own special kind of insane. That the price of keeping your child alive could fluctuate based on paperwork. He had $7,400 in savings. He had a payment plan arrangement with Millhaven Children's Medical Center that he'd been maintaining faithfully for 11 months. He had 2 credit cards, both carrying balances he preferred not to think about before bed. He was not drowning. He was clear-eyed about the fact that he was not drowning. But the surface of the water was close enough that he could see it. The truck's headlights swept across Granger Avenue, rain sheeting sideways now, gutters beginning to run. He passed the Sunoco station, the Vietnamese place he liked, but hadn't been to in months, the dry cleaner that had been going out of business for what seemed like 3 years. Millhaven was that kind of city. Not collapsed, not thriving, just holding on with both hands and pretending it wasn't tired. He almost missed her. She was standing at the corner of Granger and Tilden, under what should have been a bus shelter but was really just a metal frame with a cracked plastic panel that stopped almost none of the rain. She was wearing dark slacks and a blazer. No jacket, no umbrella. And she was standing very still in a way that struck him as strange. Most people in the rain hunched. They crossed their arms and pulled their shoulders up. She was just standing there, getting soaked, looking at her phone with an expression that suggested the phone was not helping. He drove past her. He went about 40 feet and then stopped. He sat there with his blinker on, rain hammering the roof, and had a brief internal argument with himself. It was late. He didn't know her. She was probably fine. There were apps for this. She had a phone. Her phone, he recalled, had not appeared to be working. He reversed. He rolled down the passenger window, which took a moment because the motor was slow, and leaned slightly across the center console. The rain immediately started coming in. "Hey," he said. "You need a ride?" She looked up from the phone. She was maybe 30, dark hair plastered to her face, and she had the kind of eyes that were doing a rapid assessment. Him, the truck, the interior, the situation. He understood that. He'd have done the same. "I'm not a—" he started, then stopped, because there wasn't a great way to finish that sentence that didn't sound worse. "My daughter's car seat's in the back, if that helps. I'm not weird. I'm just... It's raining." Something shifted in her expression. A small decision. "Okay," she said. She climbed in, pulling the door shut, and immediately a small lake transferred itself from her blazer to his passenger seat. She looked at the seat and then at him. "Sorry," she said. "It's a work truck," he said. "Don't worry about it." He pulled back into traffic. For about 30 seconds, neither of them said anything, which Ethan was fine with. He wasn't the type who needed to fill silence. "Victoria," she said finally. "My name is Victoria." "Ethan." He glanced at her. "Where are you headed?" She gave him an address. The Meridian Tower on West Aldine, which was about 2 miles out of his way, but not enough to matter. He knew the building vaguely. Glass and steel, went up maybe 15 years ago during one of Millhaven's periodic attempts at downtown revitalization. Nice building. Made everything around it look more tired than it actually was. "You live there?" he asked, not because it was his business, just conversation. "I'm staying there," she said. "Temporarily." He nodded. He turned onto Harwick Street, which would take them west, and turned the heat up because she was visibly cold despite the warmth of the cab. "Long day?" he asked. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You could say that." "Me too." She looked at him. "What do you do?" HVAC. Heating and cooling systems, mostly residential, some commercial. He paused. "Before you ask, no, I don't like summer. Yes, I know. Everyone thinks that's funny." She smiled. It was the first time she'd smiled, and it changed her face considerably, made her look younger, a little less armored. "I wasn't going to ask that." "What were you going to ask?" "I was going to ask how long you've been doing it." 11 years, he said. "Went through the apprenticeship program right out of high school. Figured I'd do it for a few years and then figure out what I actually wanted to do. Turned out this was it." "You like it?" He considered that honestly. "Yeah, I like fixing things. I like that there's always an answer. It's either working or it's not. And if it's not, there's a reason, and you just have to find it. He shrugged. Not a lot of things in life are like that. Victoria was quiet for a moment, looking out the rain-blurred window. No, she said. They're not. He had the radio off, and the heater going, and the wipers cutting back and forth, and it was actually okay, this drive. Not awkward. She didn't seem like someone who needed to perform conversation, which he appreciated. It was when they stopped at the light on Harwick and Brennan that she saw it. He had a photograph clipped to the sun visor, a habit he'd started maybe 2 years ago, a photo of Sophie from her last birthday, grinning in front of a chocolate cake with a Blue 9 candle, her dark hair in a messy side braid, wearing the yellow sweater he'd gotten her. Behind her on the kitchen table, you could see the edge of a manila folder with the Millhaven Children's Medical Center letterhead on it. It was visible if you knew what you were looking at, and something made him think Victoria knew exactly what she was looking at. She didn't say anything immediately. Your daughter? She asked after a moment. Yeah, Sophie. He glanced at the photo the way he always did, involuntary, like checking to make sure it was still there. She's 9. She's beautiful. Yeah. He said it simply, without the self-conscious modifier some parents added. Just yeah. Another pause. Is she okay? Victoria asked, and something in the question was careful, not nosy careful. Careful like she was asking something she actually wanted to know the answer to. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. The light turned green. She will be, he said, which was both an answer and a thing he said out loud because he needed to keep saying it. Victoria looked back at the photograph for another second. He couldn't see her expression from the driver's seat, which was probably fine. They didn't talk much for the rest of the drive, not because it was bad. It just felt like they'd both said something real, and neither wanted to bury it under filler. He pulled up in front of Meridian Tower at 8:47 p.m. The rain was still going strong, but the building had a canopy over the entrance, so she'd have a few dry feet to cover. She reached for the door handle and then stopped. Ethan, she said. Yeah. Thank you. She said it the way people say things when they mean more than the literal words and don't have a better container for it. Genuinely. It's 2 miles, he said. I know, she said. Still. She got out, pulled her ruined blazer a little tighter, and walked under the canopy and through the glass doors. He watched until she was inside, old habit, not specific to her, and then pulled back into traffic and headed home. He didn't think about her again that night. He thought about Sophie, who was, in fact, on the couch, with a book when he got home, Mrs. Calloway knitting in the armchair beside her with the television on low. Sophie looked up when he came in and said, Dad, did you know otters hold hands when they sleep so they don't float away from each other? I did not know that, he said, dropping his bag by the door and coming to sit on the edge of the couch. It's called a raft, she said. When a bunch of otters sleep together, they call it a raft. Huh. He put his hand on top of her head the way he always did. She let him, the way she always did, which he knew wouldn't last forever. Smart animals. The smartest, she said, with the certainty of someone who had recently decided this. Mrs. Calloway left around 9:50. He made Sophie's lunch for the next day while she brushed her teeth. He checked her homework, mostly fine. One math problem she'd set up wrong, but gotten the right answer through some approach he didn't follow, which he let go. He sat on the edge of her bed while she settled in, the way he'd done since she was old enough to have an opinion about the pre-sleep ritual. She liked it quiet at the end. No more conversation, just presence. He understood that. Dad? She said from under the covers. Yeah, Soph. Are you tired? A little. You always say a little. I'm tired, he said. How's that? Better, she said, and closed her eyes. He turned off her lamp and stood there in the doorway for a moment, the way parents do, for reasons they couldn't explain, as if they need the image to sustain them through something. Then he went to the kitchen table, opened the folder that lived in the second drawer, the folder with the payment plan documents, the insurance denials, the estimate from Dr. Reyes's office, and he sat with it for a while the way you sit with a problem that doesn't have a solution yet. Not solving, just staying with it. His phone showed a balance reminder from Millhaven Children's. Next payment due in 11 days. $420. He had it. He could make it, and the one after, and probably the one after that. What he couldn't make was the surgery itself. He closed the folder and went to bed. He didn't know, couldn't have known, that 11 blocks away, in a corner suite on the 23rd floor of Meridian Tower, Victoria Langford was standing at her window in dry clothes with a glass of water she wasn't drinking, looking out at the rain-soaked city. Her assistant, Marcus, had texted 3 times during the car ride and called twice since. She hadn't answered yet. The messages were all variations of the same thing. The board meeting had been rescheduled to tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., and several key investors had been making noises that she needed to get ahead of. She knew. She'd deal with it. What she was doing right now, standing at the window, was thinking about a photograph clipped to a sun visor. A little girl in a yellow sweater. A manila envelope with a hospital letterhead she'd recognized because it was her hospital. Technically, legally, financially, hers. A place she'd acquired 18 months ago when it was 6 weeks from closing and nobody else would step in. Millhaven Children's Medical Center. She pressed her palm against the cool glass and thought. She pulled out her personal phone, not the one Marcus managed, the one with 3 contacts in it, and typed a name into the patient portal she had access to as the facility's legal owner. She almost stopped herself. It felt like a violation of something, though technically it wasn't. She had access. She had every access. She typed, Sophie Mercer, Pediatric Cardiology. The file loaded. She read it standing at the window for a long time while the rain ran down the glass. 9 years old, diagnosed at 6 with a congenital aortic valve defect. Regular monitoring for 3 years, stable enough to manage. Deterioration noted at her most recent imaging. Doctor. Reyes. She knew Reyes, a careful, excellent physician with 0 patience for administrative nonsense, had flagged the case for surgical prioritization. Financial status? Active payment plan. Single guardian household. Father. Ethan J. Mercer, 32. Insurance. Limited commercial plan through a small business policy. Outstanding estimated patient responsibility. Between $18,000 and $23,000 depending on billing code application. There was a note from the financial counseling office. They'd reviewed the case for the hospital's existing assistance fund, which was small and chronically underfunded. The note said, Family does not meet current asset threshold for full assistance. Father has declined charitable referral, stated concern that other families may have greater need. She read that line twice. Father has declined charitable referral, stated concern that other families may have greater need. She closed the file. She stood there for another minute, glass of water still untouched, rain still going, city still doing whatever cities do when nobody's watching. Okay, she said, to no one. Then she picked up the phone with Marcus's 3 missed calls and called him back. The board meeting ran long, as board meetings at Millhaven Children's tended to. Victoria sat at the head of the table in a conference room that smelled like recycled air and old ambition, and she listened to the presentation from CFO Gerald Haas with her hands folded in front of her and her expression neutral. Gerald was good with numbers in the way that certain people are good with numbers. Not just skilled at them, but emotionally aligned with them, as if the financial reality were the only reality worth discussing. He was explaining in careful language why the Pediatric Assistance Fund was a liability. It's not that the program doesn't have merit, Gerald said, adjusting his glasses. It's that the current model is unsustainable. We're approving cases on a rolling basis with no consistent eligibility criteria, which creates legal exposure. And the fund itself is pulling from operating reserves that we need for capital improvement projects that are also, I want to note, pending your approval for 2 quarters now. Around the table, 7 people, mix of board members and senior administrators. Most of them had been here before she acquired the hospital. Most of them were fine at their jobs. A few of them, Victoria had concluded over 18 months, primarily cared about the institution as an institution, as a structure to be maintained, rather than as a place where sick children came to be made less sick. She let Gerald finish. What's the current fund balance? She asked. Approximately $400,000. And the annual spend? Last year, $2.1 million. So we're not even close to self-sustaining. Correct. Which is why, how many families did the fund serve last year? Gerald looked briefly annoyed in the specific way people look annoyed when the conversation moves from financials to outcomes without warning. He glanced at the woman to his left, Brenda Cho, head of patient services. Brenda had a printout. 312 families, Brenda said. Full or partial coverage of out-of-pocket costs for pediatric procedures, mostly cardiac, oncology, and neurology. Victoria nodded slowly. 312. The point, Gerald started. What's the average procedure cost for those families, net of insurance? Brenda looked at the printout. Average patient responsibility before fund assistance, about $19,000. Range from about 8 to 43, depending on procedure. So for an average of $19,000, Victoria said, we made the difference between a child getting a procedure and not getting a procedure. We can't know that every family would have... Gerald, she said it quietly. He stopped. I understand the numbers. I was doing this before any of you were briefing me on it. What I'm asking you to do right now is tell me what the fund needs to be genuinely sustainable. Not just this year, not a Band-Aid, sustainably and indefinitely serving the population that currently depends on it. Gerald looked at her for a moment. He was not used to this kind of question. It wasn't the question the previous hospital administration had ever asked. To run at last year's volume, he said slowly, self-sustaining, you'd need an endowed principal of somewhere between 30 and 40 million conservatively invested. Silence around the table. Plus administrative overhead and a proper eligibility framework, Brenda added, because she was the kind of person who added things accurately. Right, Victoria said. 30 to 40 million. Okay. More silence. Board member Leonard Price, 63, former hospital CEO, someone who'd been on 3 boards simultaneously for 20 years and wore the experience as a kind of armor, cleared his throat. Victoria, I think we all respect your passion for this program, but you're not suggesting the hospital. No, she said. The hospital's not going to fund it. I am. The room went still in a particular way. Rooms go still when something's been said that everyone understands will not be unsaid. That's an extraordinary personal commitment, Brenda said. It's an extraordinary problem. Victoria picked up her pen, looked at it, set it down. Let's talk about the structure. It needs to be a standalone foundation, separate legal entity, so it's not exposed to the hospital's operational fluctuations. It needs a permanent endowment, independent investment oversight, and an eligibility framework that's clear, consistent, and genuinely accessible. Not a fund that families have to find out about through the right social worker. It should be proactively offered. She paused. Every family facing catastrophic pediatric medical costs in this city should know this exists before they have to ask. Leonard cleared his throat again. He did this when he was about to say something he knew might land badly. The investment community is going to ask questions. This is a significant personal allocation. Some of our larger institutional partners may wonder whether my priorities are where they should be, she finished. Yes, I imagine they will. And I'll have that conversation, but this is what's happening. She looked around the table. I need legal to start the foundation structure this week. Gerald, I need a full projection model for a $35 million endowment, sustainable at last year's program volume with a 15% growth buffer. Brenda, I need to understand what a proactive outreach model looks like, how families are identified, how the offer is made, what the timeline looks like from diagnosis to fund assistance. She stood up, which meant the meeting was over. Several people stood immediately. A few were still processing. 312 families last year, she said, gathering her folder. That number goes up, not down. She walked out. Marcus was waiting in the hallway with coffee and a look that meant things. Good meeting? He asked. Define good. Did anyone leave the room angry? Uncertain, she said. Leonard definitely left complicated. He called me 40 minutes ago to ask when you were available to discuss strategic alignment. Tell him Friday. She took the coffee. What's the medical affairs schedule look like this afternoon? You have a 2 o'clock with Dr. Reyes, or... He requested it, pediatric cardiology case review. Routine, his office said. She nodded, though she knew it wasn't routine. She knew exactly which case was on that afternoon's agenda because she'd spent an hour the previous night going back through Sophie Mercer's file with a legal pad and a focus that had surprised even her. "I'll take it in his office," she said, "not the boardroom." "It's always in his office. He refuses to come up here." "Smart man." She turned toward the elevator. "What else?" "Chen Capital wants a meeting this week about the Q3 projections." "Friday." "You said Friday for Leonard." "Then Monday." She stepped into the elevator. "Block Monday for difficult conversations." Dr. James Reyes had been a pediatric cardiologist for 19 years and had approximately 0 patience for people who walked into his office like they owned the place, which, in Victoria Langford's case, was technically accurate and which he found deeply ironic. He'd liked her, actually, from the beginning. When she'd acquired Millhaven Children's the previous year, she'd done something no new owner had ever done in his experience. She'd scheduled individual meetings with every department head, not to explain her vision, but to ask questions and then stay quiet while people answered. She'd sat in his office for 90 minutes the first time and hadn't interrupted once, which was frankly miraculous. But there were things about her he found puzzling. The way she moved through the hospital sometimes, not executive tours, but just showing up in the halls, in the cafeteria, sitting in the waiting rooms for 20 minutes at a stretch with a cup of coffee like she was doing research. The way she remembered specifics about cases she'd only seen on paper. The way she'd read a patient file and 2 weeks later ask about a detail no one would normally track. He had a theory about her. He hadn't shared it with anyone. He poured her a coffee from the carafe on his credenza. His office was small and honest, bookshelves that had actually been used, a desk with real paper on it, and set it in front of her without asking. "Thanks," she said. "The case I flagged for today," he said, settling into his chair. "Sophie Mercer, 9 years old, congenital aortic valve defect, deteriorating." He slid a folder across the desk. "We're at a decision point. The valve is compensating enough that she's not in immediate crisis, but the window for a clean intervention is closing. If we wait another 2 to 3 months, we're looking at significantly elevated surgical risk." Victoria opened the folder. She'd already read most of it, but she read it again in front of him, which he appreciated. "Timeline for surgical scheduling?" she asked. "Ideally within 6 weeks. We have the surgical team capacity. The block is financial." "Has the family been re-referred to the assistance fund?" Reyes paused. "Once. The father declined. The financial counselor's notes say he expressed concern about taking resources that might be needed by other families. He said it the way he'd said it to himself several times since reading it, with something that was equal parts respect and frustration. He's maintaining his payment plan. He's looking at other options, but his timeline and the surgical timeline don't align, Victoria said. "No." She was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the folder. "What's he like? The father, from what you've seen?" Reyes considered the question. "I've met with him 3 times. He comes alone, always, never misses, takes notes." He paused. "He asked me at our last appointment to explain the risk differential between waiting 8 weeks and waiting 16 weeks, because he wanted to understand his options clearly. Most parents in that situation are either in denial or in panic. He was just present, asking the right questions." He looked at her. "He's managing something very heavy, very quietly." "Yes," Victoria said, and Reyes noticed something in her voice that he couldn't quite categorize. "The other thing," he said carefully, "is that he's specifically private about it. He's not the type who wants someone to swoop in. I've learned to read that. If someone offers him something that feels like charity, he'll find a reason why someone else needs it more." Victoria closed the folder. She held it in her lap and looked at the middle distance. "James," she said. She was one of 3 people in the hospital who called him by his first name, and he'd never asked her to stop. "What would it take to get Sophie Mercer into the OR within 6 weeks?" "Surgery's covered. Insurance handles the base procedure. The patient responsibility is the issue. Somewhere around 20,000, which the family can't produce on their timeline without help. And if the foundation were operational by then, the new structure I'm building, if the eligibility criteria are what you described in the memo Marcus sent," Reyes paused. She qualifies. Clearly. And the father wouldn't be taking anything away from anyone. It's an endowment. That's the whole point. He'll need to understand that, Victoria said. Not just be told it. He'll need to actually understand it. Yes. Reyes watched her. He set down his coffee. Victoria, how do you know what kind of man he is? She looked at him directly. I read his file. You've read hundreds of files. Yes. He held her gaze for a moment, and she held his. I'm not going to ask, he said. Probably wise, she said. She stood, picked up her folder, and walked to the door. Stopped. 6 weeks, she said. Let's make that happen. Ethan's Tuesday the following week was better than the previous one, which wasn't saying much. The commercial job on Ferris Boulevard wrapped early, a minor miracle, and by 4:30 he was actually home, which almost never happened on a Tuesday. He texted Mrs. Calloway that he'd pick Sophie up himself, and he was pulling into the school pickup line at 3:15 when his phone rang. Millhaven Children's Medical Center. He answered it on the second ring. Mr. Mercer, this is Diane from the Financial Counseling Office. I'm calling because I wanted to let you know about a change in how the hospital's assistance program is being structured. I was wondering if you had a few minutes. Is something wrong with Sophie's case? No. This is just about the financial side. The hospital's launching a new assistance foundation. It's still in development, but we've been asked to reach out to families in Sophie's situation specifically because it may open some options that weren't available before. Ethan stared out the windshield at the school entrance. Kids were starting to trickle out. What kind of options? He said carefully. The foundation would cover patient responsibility costs for qualifying families, not as a loan, not charity in the traditional sense, but as a permanent endowment program. The way it's been explained to me, it's funded independently of the hospital's operating budget, so families using it aren't taking away from the facility's other services. Other families in need aren't affected. Ethan was quiet. Mr. Mercer, I heard you, he said. He stopped. Who funds it? A beat. The hospital's owner, from what I understand. She's establishing it as a private foundation. He watched Sophie come through the school doors, backpack slightly too large for her, already scanning for his truck in the line. She spotted it, and her face did the thing it did. A small brightening, subtle, but he'd been watching that face for 9 years, and he could read it like weather. Okay, he said slowly. Send me the information. Of course. I'll email the eligibility overview and the application. And what's the timeline, if the application is approved? The foundation's targeting full operation within 4 to 6 weeks. Sophie reached the truck and pulled open the passenger door, climbed up, dropped her bag on the floor, and said, Dad, my math teacher said I need to redo problem 7 because my method was non-standard. Was your answer right? He said, still holding the phone. Yeah. Then tell her the standard was the one with the wrong answer. He brought the phone back. Sorry. My daughter just got in. Can you email me everything? Absolutely. We'll be in touch, Mr. Mercer. He hung up. Sophie was looking at him with the specific expression she wore when she understood more than she was supposed to. Hospital? She said. Finance office, he said. Nothing important. She looked at him for another second. She was 9 and she was smart, and she knew what finance office meant because she'd grown up in a house where those conversations happened in the kitchen, and she'd never been specifically shielded from the weight of them, only from the worst of his own fear. Okay, she said, and reached for her backpack zipper. Can we get tacos? It's Tuesday, he said. That's literally when tacos are supposed to happen, Dad. He drove, and he let the question from the phone call sit somewhere in the back of his mind where things went when he wasn't ready to look at them directly. A permanent endowment, the hospital's owner, independent of operating budget. He didn't know anything about the hospital's owner. He'd never had a reason to. He got tacos with his daughter on a Tuesday, and they ate them in the truck in the parking lot because Sophie said it was more fun that way, which it was, and for 45 minutes, the folder in the second kitchen drawer didn't exist at all. The foundation paperwork took 3 weeks to begin to exist in the way legal paperwork takes to exist. Slowly, then an avalanche. Victoria's attorneys worked fast because she paid them to, and because she'd been clear about the timeline. The board was not enthusiastic, then neutral, then cautiously supportive, in the reliable order that institutional opinion usually moved. Leonard Price called on a Thursday. He did not wait until Friday. "I want to make sure I understand the scope here," he said. He was the type who began difficult conversations with procedural language. "You're committing $35 million in personal capital to an independent charitable entity that will be associated with the hospital, but not associated," she said. She was in the hospital cafeteria, eating a sandwich that was adequate, watching a kid across the room argue with his mother about whether a cookie was a reasonable pre-surgery snack. Name for the hospital, different governance structure. "And you're doing this against the advice of your personal wealth management team?" "They advised caution, they didn't advise against." She paused. "And I've done things against actual advice before. It usually works out." "The investors are worried, Victoria. The institutional partners especially. They're going to wonder whether this signals a shift in how you see your role here, whether you're planning to prioritize—" "Leonard?" She said it the same way she'd said it in the boardroom. He stopped. "I bought this hospital because it was going to close, not because it was a smart investment vehicle, not because I saw an undervalued asset. I bought it because 400 children a year receive cardiac care here, and there was nobody else in the room willing to make the call." She took a bite of her sandwich. "The investors knew what I was when they partnered with me. If the foundation changes their read, we can have that conversation, but the foundation is happening." A long pause. "You're going to get a lot of attention," he said finally. "Careful now, not argumentative. When this goes public, $35 million pediatric assistance endowment. That's a significant story. It's a good program. It deserves attention. It's also—" He stopped himself. "Say it," she said. "It's also going to prompt people to ask what prompted it, whether there's a specific case, a specific family. The foundation was prompted by the fact that 312 families last year were one billing code away from not being able to get their kids treated," she said. "That's the story. That's the only story." She set down her sandwich. "Were you going to make another point?" A beat. "No," he said. "I think that covers it." She hung up, looked at her sandwich, looked at the kid across the room, who had apparently won the cookie argument, and finished her lunch. 3 weeks and 2 days after the call from Diane in the financial counseling office, another envelope arrived. Physical mail, which felt deliberate, like whoever had arranged this understood something about the kind of person Ethan was. He opened it at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening while Sophie was in the bath. The Sophie Mercer Pediatric Assistance Fund, administered by the Millhaven Children's Medical Foundation. Full coverage of estimated patient responsibility costs for Sophie Mercer's aortic valve repair procedure. No repayment required. Available for scheduling effective immediately. A separate letter, handwritten on plain paper without letterhead, said, "Mr. Mercer, this isn't charity, it's a program. 312 families used it last year. Next year, more. Your daughter being treated doesn't take anything from anyone." It wasn't signed. He sat with the letter for a long time. Then he called Dr. Reyes's office and told the receptionist he was ready to schedule the surgery. Sophie was in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas when he got off the phone, hair damp, looking at him with the particular alertness of a child who understands more than the adults around her realize. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah, Soph. Is it good news?" He looked at his daughter standing in the kitchen doorway at 9 years old, small and certain and entirely unafraid of the answer, because she'd been raised by a man who didn't pretend things were fine when they weren't, who had always talked to her like her questions deserved honest answers. "Yeah," he said. "It's good news." She nodded, once the way she did when something confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Okay," she said. "Can you make hot chocolate?" "It's 70 degrees outside." "Hot chocolate isn't seasonal, Dad. It's a mood." He made the hot chocolate. He sat at the table while Sophie sat across from him with her mug and her book about otters. And through the kitchen window, Millhaven was doing its thing, holding on, a little tired, mostly fine, and the folder in the second drawer was still there. But something about it had changed. The weight of it was different now. Not gone, just different. He thought about the note. He thought about the handwriting. You see, quick, not flowery. And about the phrase it's a program, not charity, and about whoever had taken the time to write it by hand instead of typing it. He didn't think about the stranger from the storm. He didn't make that connection yet. He just drank his hot chocolate across from his daughter, who read to him, unprompted, 3 paragraphs about otter rafts, and he listened. The surgery was scheduled for a Thursday, 5 weeks out. Ethan wrote the date on the whiteboard in the kitchen, the one Sophie had talked him into buying 2 years ago because she said organized people used whiteboards, which was not something a 7-year-old should know, but which he'd found impossible to argue with. The date sat there in red marker under Sophie's homework schedule and his work calendar and a drawing she'd taped up of 2 otters holding hands, which she'd done in colored pencil and which was actually pretty good. He looked at the date most mornings while the coffee brewed. He didn't feel relief yet, not exactly. He felt something more like the absence of a particular kind of dread, like a sound you've been hearing so long you've stopped noticing it, and then it stops, and the silence itself takes some getting used to. The payment confirmation from the foundation had come through digitally 3 days after the letter. Everything covered, no balance. He'd read it twice, then printed it and put it in the folder in the second drawer, and then stood in the kitchen for a moment, not quite knowing what to do with his hands. He told Mrs. Calloway. She cried briefly, and then immediately started talking about what she was going to bake when Sophie was recovered, as if the baking were already a foregone conclusion, which Ethan appreciated. He told his work friend Danny Okafor, who said, "Man, finally," and bought him a beer he hadn't asked for. He didn't tell anyone else because there wasn't really anyone else to tell, which was a fact about his life he'd made a kind of peace with. He told Sophie. He sat her down on a Saturday morning, the week after the date went on the whiteboard, and explained it carefully. Not dumbed down because she hated that, but in the order that made sense. The surgery was scheduled. The money was handled. Dr. Reyes and his team were very good at this specific thing. She was going to be under anesthesia and she would not feel anything, and when she woke up, he would be right there. Sophie listened to all of it, with her hands in her lap and her expression doing very little. "Does it fix it?" she asked. "The valve? Does surgery fix it for good?" Dr. Reyes says it should be a long-term solution. Yeah. Define long-term. He looked at her. "Where did you learn to talk like that?" "Books," she said. "Decades," he said. That's what he said, decades. She nodded. She picked at a thread on her sleeve. "Are you scared?" he asked. She thought about it, which he appreciated because she wasn't the type to give the easy answer. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Yeah," he said. She nodded again, like they'd agreed on something that needed agreeing on, and then she asked if they could have pancakes, and so they had pancakes, and that was the conversation. What he didn't tell her, what he managed not to think about too directly in the daylight hours, was the specific quality of fear that lived in him separately from the logistical fear, the one that had nothing to do with money or scheduling. It was older than all of that. It was the one that lived in the 3 a.m. version of him, the one who lay in the dark and remembered that the universe did not, in fact, owe anyone a particular outcome, and that sometimes things went wrong regardless of preparation or love or sheer force of will. He didn't let himself stay in that place long. He'd gotten good at that, the way you get good at things you have to survive. He worked. He made lunches. He drove Sophie to school and picked her up and helped with homework he sometimes didn't understand, and sat on the edge of her bed in the evenings, and he put one foot in front of the other, which was essentially the whole plan. It was into this particular rhythm that he met Victoria again. It happened the way things happen when you're not expecting them, sideways, on a Wednesday afternoon, in the last place he'd have thought to look. He'd been called to Millhaven Children's Medical Center to fix a heating unit malfunction in the East Wing. Not unusual, he'd done service work for the hospital 3 or 4 times in the past year through a facilities maintenance contract. The work was straightforward. A variable air volume box on the 3rd floor had been cycling wrong, throwing the whole zone off. He'd been up since 5:30, had 2 other calls before noon, and arrived at the hospital at 2:15 with his tool bag and a coffee that had gone cold. The facilities manager, a guy named Bob Petrie, who wore the same brand of Carhartt jacket every season regardless of weather, met him at the service entrance and walked him up. "The pediatric wing's been running about 4 degrees warm since Monday," Bob said, in the elevator. "Patients and staff both complaining." VAV box, probably. Could be a damper actuator. Ethan sipped the cold coffee. I'll need access to the ceiling. Doc on duty said to keep noise to a minimum. Kids trying to sleep. Always. They got off on the third floor. Bob pointed him toward the service closet, and then Bob's radio went off and he disappeared down the hall. Ethan found the access panel, pulled out his tools, and got to work. He was maybe 20 minutes in, lying half inside a ceiling access panel, flashlight clamped between his jaw and his shoulder, tracing a control wire that had worked itself loose, when he heard voices in the corridor below. Not loud. A doctor and someone else. He wasn't paying attention exactly, until he heard something that made him go still. The Mercer case. Surgery set for the 17th. Reyes is confident about the outcome. A pause. Then the other voice, lower, a woman's. Any concerns with the pre-op labs? All clear as of this morning. Ethan stayed still. He recognized Reyes's voice. He'd heard it enough times across that desk. The other voice he didn't recognize, but something in the way she asked about Sophie. Specific, immediate, not like a colleague running through a checklist, but like someone who wanted to actually know, made him hold the flashlight steady and listen. Good, the woman said. Thank you, James. Footsteps. He shifted slightly so he could angle his head toward the corridor below. Through the gap in the access panel, he could see a portion of the hall, white floor, the corner of the nurse's station, and then a figure walking past in what his brain registered as dark slacks and a blazer. He couldn't see her face. The angle was wrong. He lay there another second, flashlight still clamped in his teeth, a loose wire in one hand, and had the peculiar sensation of something almost clicking into place without quite getting there, like the last number of a combination you can't quite read. Then the figure rounded the corner and was gone. He got back to work. It took him another 40 minutes to sort out the VAV issue. It was the actuator, after all, stuck at 20% open, and he had a replacement in his bag. And when he came down from the ceiling and was cleaning up his tools, a woman came around the corner of the corridor and nearly walked into him. They both stopped. The world took about 2 seconds to catch up. Victoria Langford, standing in a hospital corridor in dark slacks and a blazer. The same person from the storm, from the corner of Granger and Tilden, from the passenger seat of his truck, with rain coming off her hair. He knew her face the way you know a face you've only seen once, but for some reason retained. The eyes doing that same rapid calibration they'd done on that Tuesday night. She recognized him at the same moment he recognized her. He could see it. The same slight recalibration, the almost imperceptible shift in her posture. Hi, he said, because it was the most honest available word. Hi, she said. A beat. He looked at his tool bag. She looked at the access panel he'd just closed. You fixed the heating, she said. VAV actuator. Damper was stuck. He straightened up, tucked a screwdriver into the bag. You work here? The question landed in the air between them, and something in her expression moved in a way he couldn't read yet. Yes, she said. In a sense. He waited, because it was a strange answer. I work on the administrative side, she said. Not clinical. She paused. How did you... She stopped. Started again. The facilities team called you? Got a maintenance contract with the hospital. Third time I've been up here this year, I think. He zipped the bag. Small world. It is, she said. She looked like she was weighing something. He almost just said, see you around, and left, because that was the path of least resistance, and he was tired, and he still had one more call before the day ended. But something about the way she was standing there, not fidgeting, not filling the silence with unnecessary words, the same quality he'd noticed in the truck, made him not leave immediately. You on your way somewhere? He asked. I was going to get coffee. There's a decent place in the cafeteria. She said it neutrally. Not an invitation, not an invitation. He looked at his watch, 45 minutes before his last call. I could do coffee, he said. They walked to the cafeteria, which was on the second floor and smelled like industrial soup and something else trying to mask the industrial soup. The coffee was, in fact, decent, a proper espresso machine, which surprised him. donated by a family some years ago according to the small plaque on the side. They sat at a table near the window, him with black coffee, her with something that involved oat milk, and the conversation started the way it had in the truck. Not forced, not performed, just two people saying actual things to each other. "What made you go into HVAC?" she asked. She held the cup with both hands. "You said you thought you'd do it for a few years and figure out what you actually wanted. Did you ever figure it out, or did this become the answer?" "Both, kind of," he said. "About 4 years in, I realized I'd been waiting to want something different, and I didn't actually want anything different. The waiting was the thing that felt wrong, not the work." He shrugged. "So I stopped waiting." She nodded. "What does a day actually look like? Walk me through it." Nobody asked him that. Not the way she asked it. Like she was genuinely building a picture of something, not making conversation. He told her. The 5 a.m. wake-up, the school drop-off if the timing worked, the first call by 7:30. The way some days were all residential, houses where people followed him from room to room, and some were friendly, and some were anxious, and some were the kind of dismissive he'd learned to let slide off. And some were commercial, warehouses and office buildings where nobody paid attention to you and you just got to work. He told her about the diagnostic process, the way he'd learned to hear problems before he could see them. She listened in a way that was not polite listening. She asked follow-up questions at the right moments, short ones, and they were always about the thing he'd just said, not about the next thing she wanted to say. At some point, he realized he'd been talking for 15 minutes, which was unusual. "You're good at that," he said. "At what?" "Listening. Most people listen until it's their turn." Something shifted in her face. Not discomfort, exactly. More like she'd been seen at a slight angle she hadn't intended. "I learned it late," she said. "I spent a long time in rooms where talking was how you held your position. Had to unlearn the habit." "What kind of rooms?" She turned her cup slowly on the table. Once, twice. "Business," she said. "Strategy meetings, boardrooms." A slight pause. A lot of talking, not a lot of listening. He looked at her. She was not uncomfortable with his looking. She held it. "You said administrative," he said. "Here at the hospital." "Yes." "What specifically?" She held his gaze for another half-second, and he had the distinct impression that she was making a decision about something. "I oversee operational direction," she said. "Decisions about how the hospital runs, what programs it offers, how resources get allocated." It was technically accurate. He took it at face value, because there was no reason not to. "Is that what you wanted to do?" he asked. "Or did you have your own version of waiting?" That made her smile, and it was the same smile from the truck, younger, less armored. "No waiting," she said. "I've known since I was about 22 that this was the direction. The specific shape of it changed, but the direction stayed the same." "Which is what?" She thought about it. Not a long pause. Just the pause of someone who doesn't reach for the pre-packaged answer. "Making things work better than they currently do," she said. "Finding systems that are failing and figuring out where the failure actually is, not just where it looks like it is, and then..." She stopped. "Doing something about it, I suppose. Not just identifying the problem." He looked at her. "That's basically what I do." She blinked, then laughed. A real one, brief, surprised out of her. "I guess it is." He finished his coffee. She had about a third of hers left. Outside the cafeteria window, the hospital parking lot was doing its quiet afternoon thing. Someone loading a wheelchair into an SUV, an orderly on a smoke break he technically wasn't supposed to be on, pigeons arguing over something near the drainage grate. "Sophie's surgery's in 5 weeks," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. He hadn't intended to. She didn't react with the kind of sudden sympathy that made him feel like a charity case. She just said, "How are you feeling about it?" in the same tone she'd used for everything else. "Better than I was," he said honestly. "The financial side got sorted." He didn't elaborate because he still felt some complicated thing about the way it had gotten sorted. The note, the foundation, the sense of an invisible hand moving pieces without asking him first, which intellectually he knew was irrational, but emotionally he hadn't entirely processed. Reyes is good. That helps. He is, she said. He looked at her. His reputation, she said. It's well regarded, institutionally. Smooth, but a beat late. Something about it registered without quite landing. He let it go. He had a job in 40 minutes. I should get moving, he said, standing. She stood too, still holding her cup. There was a moment, not awkward, not loaded, just present, where neither of them said anything. This keeps happening, he said, running into you. Small city, she said. Yeah. He picked up his bag. Thanks for the coffee. You paid for yours. The conversation, then. He said it without thinking, and then let it stand because it was true. She held his gaze for just a moment, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't catalog yet. Not quite warmth, not quite something else. Some combination that he filed away without meaning to, the way you file a sound you've heard before but can't immediately place. He left. She watched him go, which he didn't see. She stood at the cafeteria window for a moment after he disappeared through the doors, cup in hand, aware that she'd done something she hadn't planned to do and wasn't sure how to categorize it. She had not lied to him. She'd told him she worked on the administrative side, that she oversaw operational direction. All true. She hadn't told him she owned the hospital because she hadn't told anyone outside of formal professional contexts, by design, and because sitting across a table from Ethan Mercer explaining that she was worth roughly $2.3 billion felt like a category error so profound she wasn't sure she had the language for it. She also hadn't told him that she knew his daughter's name, her diagnosis, her surgical timeline, the balance of his payment plan, and the fact that the note that had come with his foundation approval letter was written in her handwriting on paper from the notepad she kept on her nightstand. She stood at the window and watched the parking lot and drank the last third of her oat milk latte, which had gone slightly cold. Marcus appeared at her elbow with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to materialize quietly. You have a 4:30 with the legal team. I know. The foundation paperwork is almost finalized. They need 2 more signatures. I'll do it tonight. He was quiet for a moment. Good coffee meeting? She looked at him. He had the expression of someone who had noticed something but was professionally uncertain whether to say so. It was fine, she said. The man with the tool bag, Marcus said, demonstrating that his peripheral vision was excellent. He looked familiar. He does service work here, HVAC. Marcus had a very controlled Bah. Should I know who he is? No, she said, and meant it, because she didn't want Ethan Mercer becoming a name that circulated in her professional orbit, didn't want anyone connecting the dots she was barely allowing herself to connect. Let's go do the 4:30. But she thought about the conversation for the rest of the afternoon and the gaps between the legal team and a phone call with her investment manager and a facilities review that ran 20 minutes long. Not continuously. She had too much going on for continuous. But in flashes. The way he'd said the conversation then. The way he talked about his work like it actually mattered to him, not performatively, just factually. The way he told her Sophie's surgery was in 5 weeks with the same directness he'd used for everything else, not asking for anything from her reaction except her honest attention. She gave depositions with less clarity than she felt in that cafeteria. She had a rule, had maintained it for years, about the intersection of personal and professional. They did not intersect. She'd built everything she had on the foundation of keeping those 2 territories from contaminating each other because she'd watched enough people lose both by letting the boundaries blur. The rule was not cruel, and it was not cold. It was structural. Ethan Mercer existed in both territories, and she had not figured out what to do with that yet. She signed the foundation paperwork at 7:30 that evening, alone in the conference room on the 23rd floor of Meridian Tower, Marcus having long since gone home. Her name went in 3 places in black ink, and that was $35 million committed to a structure that would exist long after she did, which was a strange thing to sit with and which she sat with anyway. She thought, signing the 3rd page, about 312 families. And one more. The weeks between the scheduling call and the surgery had a particular texture. Not slow, not fast, but dense, like everything had a little more weight than usual without necessarily being harder. Ethan noticed Sophie watching him sometimes in the evenings with the expression she wore when she was computing something. She didn't ask many questions about the surgery itself after that Saturday morning conversation, which he chose to read as trust rather than avoidance, though he knew it was probably some of both. She did, however, start being slightly nicer to him. He noticed this around the third week, when she voluntarily offered to help clean up after dinner without being asked, and then got embarrassed when he pointed it out. "I just didn't feel like leaving a mess," she said. "You always feel like leaving a mess," he said. "People change, Dad." He did not point out that she left a mess the next 2 evenings, because he was not cruel. He ran into Victoria twice more before the surgery, both times at the hospital, which stopped being surprising after the second occurrence and became something else he didn't have a clean name for. The second time was in the corridor near the administrative wing, both of them going in opposite directions, and they stopped and talked for maybe 8 minutes about nothing particularly important. She asked about his week, he asked about hers. They covered the recent bout of unseasonably hot weather and the resurfacing project on Granger Avenue that had been causing traffic headaches for 2 weeks. It was unremarkable. He thought about it on the way home. The third time was the one that mattered. It was a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks before the surgery. He'd finished his last call by 3 and had picked Sophie up early. Her school had a half day, and Mrs. Calloway was at a dentist appointment. And on an impulse he couldn't entirely explain, he'd brought her to the hospital for her pre-op labs, which were scheduled anyway, but had arrived 30 minutes early and taken her to the cafeteria for hot chocolate while they waited. Sophie was reading. She read everywhere: waiting rooms, restaurants, the truck, twice memorably while also walking down a sidewalk in a way that had given him a genuine scare. The book was the one about marine mammals she'd moved on to after fully exhausting the otter literature. She was sitting across from him with the mug held in both hands and her eyes on the page, and she looked, he thought, remarkably normal. A kid in a hospital cafeteria reading a book. You wouldn't know, looking at her. You wouldn't know the thing her heart was doing quietly inside her chest. He was watching her when Victoria walked in. She didn't see them immediately. She was heading for the coffee machine with the distracted purposefulness of someone between two things, and he almost didn't say anything. But then Sophie looked up from her book and looked directly at Victoria with the uncanny aim of a child who senses when an adult in the room is specifically relevant. "Dad," Sophie said. "Yeah." "Who's that?" Before he could answer, Victoria looked up and found them. This time the recognition was immediate and mutual, no lag. She crossed to their table, which surprised him slightly. She did it without hesitation, like it had already been decided. "Hi," she said. "Hey," he said. He looked at Sophie. "This is Victoria. She works at the hospital." Sophie assessed her with the frank directness she'd had since she was about 4. "What part?" "The administrative part," Victoria said. She pulled out the chair across from Sophie without asking, which Sophie seemed to approve of. She had more respect for people who didn't hover uncertainly at the edge of conversations. "What are you reading?" Sophie tilted the book. "Marine mammals, Pacific species. I was doing otters, but I finished all the good otter books, so now I'm doing the broader taxonomy." "The broader taxonomy," Victoria repeated without mockery. "What's your favorite so far?" "Sea otters are still the best," Sophie said, "but I have a lot of respect for harbor seals. They're underrated." "Why underrated?" Sophie put the book down, which was the highest honor she could confer on a conversation. "Because everyone talks about dolphins and whales, and nobody talks about seals. But seals are actually more interesting if you look at their behavior. They're very independent. They don't need to be in groups to survive." Victoria looked at her for a second. "That is underrated," she said. Sophie nodded, satisfied. She picked the book back up but didn't actually read it, which meant she was still paying attention. Ethan looked at Victoria across the table. She'd gotten herself a cup of coffee at some point, and she was holding it the same way she always held coffee, both hands, like she was getting warmth from it. "Pre-op labs?" she said quietly. "In 30 minutes, he said. "She's calm about it. I am less calm about it." "That seems right," Victoria said. She glanced at Sophie, who was doing the thing where you look like you're reading but you're listening. "You seem like someone who's calm about most things," she said to Sophie. Sophie considered this seriously. "I'm calm about most things," she agreed. "I'm not calm about spiders or airports. Airports are too loud." Airports are too loud, Victoria said. I agree with that completely. Do you travel a lot? A small pause. More than I'd like. Why do you do it then? Victoria looked at her, and then she did something that Ethan had been watching her do across several conversations. She didn't reach for the easy adult answer, the one that was technically true but deflecting. She said, because some things are worth the inconvenience of getting there. Sophie seemed to accept this. Like what? Different things, different times. She turned the cup. Right now, this city. Ethan looked at her when she said that. She didn't look back at him immediately, and when she did, her expression was neutral enough that he couldn't read it, and he didn't try. Sophie's pre-op appointment was the routine kind. Blood work, vitals, a brief check-in with the attending nurse who knew Sophie by now and called her Miss Mercer in a way that Sophie pretended to find embarrassing but actually liked. Ethan sat in the waiting area while Sophie was in with the nurse, and the waiting area had plastic chairs and a fish tank that one fish seemed to be using more than its share of, and he sat with his hands loose between his knees and did the thing where he didn't let himself think about the 17th. Victoria sat down next to him. He hadn't expected that. You don't have to, he started. I know, she said. He looked at the fish tank. She's great, Victoria said. She's genuinely great. Yeah, he said, quiet. She's the whole thing. He paused. I know people say that about their kids, but I'm not sure I mean it the same way most people mean it. I don't mean she's the reason I exist or whatever. I mean, he stopped, looked for the right version. I was a specific kind of person before she was born, and I'm a different person now. And the difference is better. Not easier. Better. Victoria was quiet. He didn't look at her. Single the whole time? She asked. Her mother left when Sophie was 2. He said it the way he always said it. Not with the anger that used to be there. Not with the version of bitterness he'd burned through somewhere around year 3. Just a fact. Wasn't equipped for it. I don't think it was malicious. I just think she looked at what the next 20 years of her life looked like and couldn't do it. He shrugged. I get that. In the abstract. But I don't get it about Sophie specifically. Knowing Sophie. You don't look at her and think, I can't do this. You look at her and think there's no possible version of me that walks away from this. He heard himself say it and was mildly surprised at how clearly he meant it. No, Victoria said softly. There isn't. He looked at her then. She was looking at the fish tank with an expression he couldn't entirely decode, something quiet happening behind her eyes that she wasn't performing for him. What about you? He asked. Any of that? Family? Kids? No, she said. Then, I made choices early that made other choices harder. I don't know if I regret it. I think I'm still deciding. That's honest. I try to be, she said, and something moved across her face. Brief, then gone. He filed it without pressing on it. Sophie came back through the door in her jacket with the star on the zipper, backpack on, marine mammal book sticking out the top. She looked at them sitting together, and her expression did something small and unreadable. All done, Ethan said. They took 3 tubes, Sophie said, with the air of someone reporting a significant injustice. 3. They need the info, he said. They could have asked, she said. He stood. Victoria stood. There was a beat where nobody quite moved yet. I hope the 17th goes well, Victoria said to Sophie. Sophie looked up at her. You know about my surgery? I work here, Victoria said. I know most of what happens here. Sophie looked at her for a moment with that direct, slightly unsettling gaze. Do you think it'll be okay? Victoria did not look at Ethan. She looked at Sophie, and she answered her the way he noticed. She answered everything, directly, without flinching. I think Dr. Reyes is excellent at what he does, she said, and I think you're stronger than most people in that situation would be. So yes, I think it's going to be okay. Sophie held her gaze for another second, and then nodded the single nod she did when something had been confirmed. Okay, she said. She looked at Ethan. Can we get the soup from the cafeteria before we leave? I want the tomato one. You hate tomato soup. I've been reconsidering it, she said. They got the tomato soup. Sophie ate about half of it, declared it inferior to hot chocolate, and abandoned the rest. Ethan drank his coffee. They left through the main entrance, Sophie with her marine mammal book and her jacket and her star zipper, and he held the door for her and watched her walk through into the afternoon light and felt the particular feeling that had no name, the one that sat between terrified and grateful, between holding on and letting go. He didn't see Victoria watching from the administrative wing window, 2 floors up. He didn't see her press 2 fingers to the glass and then step back and turn away, walking quickly down the hallway toward the 4:30 that was already starting without her, with the expression of someone who had done something they couldn't undo and wasn't sure whether that was a problem. It wasn't a problem yet. The 17th was 2 weeks away. The surgery went well. That sentence, 4 words, the most important 4 words of Ethan's year, came from Dr. Reyes at 11:47 in the morning on the 17th, delivered in the hallway outside the surgical suite with the particular economy of a man who understood that families waiting for news did not need preamble. He said it, then said the specifics. Valve repair successful, no complications, Sophie was in recovery and would be moved to the pediatric ICU for observation overnight. Standard protocol, all vitals strong. Ethan nodded through all of it. He wrote the key words in his notebook the way he always did at these appointments, not because he'd forget, but because the act of writing made things real in a way that just hearing them didn't. Reyes put a hand briefly on his shoulder, unexpected because Reyes was not a shoulder touch kind of doctor, and said, "She did well, Ethan. She's a tough kid," and then walked back through the surgical suite doors. Ethan stood alone in the hallway for about 90 seconds. The hallway was beige and fluorescent, and there was a hand-washing reminder poster on the wall and a cart of linens parked near the elevator, and it was deeply, aggressively ordinary, and he stood in it with his hands at his sides and let himself feel something he'd been not feeling for 8 months. Then he sat down in the nearest chair and called Mrs. Calloway, who cried again, this time for longer. He texted Danny Okafor, who replied with 3 exclamation points and a beer emoji. He sat there another few minutes and looked at the hand-washing poster and breathed. He didn't call anyone else, because there wasn't anyone else. He was aware of that fact without bitterness, the way you're aware of a scar, just part of the terrain. He was allowed into the recovery room at 1:15. Sophie was still mostly under, groggy and pale against the pillow, a monitor on her finger and leads on her chest and an IV in her small arm. She looked younger asleep. She always did. He sat in the chair beside her bed and put his hand over hers, not holding, just there. And he stayed. She woke up around 2:30, surfacing slowly. The first thing she said was, "Did it work?" "Yeah," he said. "It worked." She closed her eyes again. A few seconds passed. "Okay," she said from somewhere almost asleep. "Good." He sat there until 6 p.m. when they moved her to the pediatric ICU, and then he sat there too. At some point a nurse brought him coffee he hadn't asked for, and he drank it without tasting it. And at some other point he put his head back against the chair and closed his eyes for what felt like 5 minutes, but was 43. And when he woke up, Sophie was watching him with the look she got when she'd caught him doing something he'd normally deny. "You were snoring," she said. "I wasn't." "A little." "I was breathing loudly." He sat up straight, worked a kink out of his neck. "How do you feel?" "Weird," she said. "Tired. My chest hurts." "It's going to for a while." "How long?" "Few weeks. Less every day." She looked at the ceiling. The ICU was quieter than the main floors. A different quality of silence, watchful rather than empty. Outside the glass partition, a nurse was charting something at a station, unhurried. "Dad," Sophie said. "Yeah." "I was scared." He looked at her. "Before?" "Yeah. In the room, before they put me under. I didn't say anything." She paused. "I didn't want to make it worse." He thought about that, his 9-year-old managing her own fear to protect him from having to manage it. He wasn't sure whether to feel proud or wrecked, and settled on somewhere in between. "You could have told me," he said. "I know." She didn't look at him. "But you were already doing the thing." "What thing?" The thing where you're holding everything together, but your jaw is like this. She demonstrated. A slight set, teeth just touching. He recognized it because he knew his own face. That's just my face, he said. It's not just your face, she said. I know your face. He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said. I was scared too. I know, she said. That's why I didn't say anything. He looked at his daughter, who was 9 years old and lying in a hospital bed 12 hours after heart surgery, and was more emotionally aware than most adults he'd ever met. And he thought, the way she was before this is not the same as the way she'll be after. Not worse. Not damaged. Just changed. Surgery did that. Not just to the body. You went under one kind of person and came back another, and usually you were okay, but the version that came back had been somewhere the version before hadn't. Next time you're scared, he said, tell me, even if I'm doing the jaw thing. She considered this. Okay, she said. Deal. She was asleep again by 7. He stayed until 10 when a night nurse whose name tag said Petra gently and firmly suggested that he go home and sleep in an actual bed, that Sophie was stable and monitored and would be right here in the morning, and that she'd seen more than a few parents wreck themselves in waiting room chairs to no benefit for anyone. He went home. He ate half a sandwich standing over the kitchen sink. He looked at the whiteboard with the date on it, the 17th, and uncapped the marker and crossed it off, which was not something he'd planned to do, but which felt necessary. He slept for 7 hours straight, the first time in months. The morning after was ordinary in the specific way that mornings after significant things are ordinary. The sun came up on schedule, the coffee maker ran through its cycle, the city outside didn't look any different. He was back at the hospital by 7:30. Sophie was awake, had eaten something resembling breakfast, and had persuaded a student nurse to bring her book up from the bag he'd left the night before. She was reading about walruses. She was there for 3 nights total. By the second day, she was sitting up and complaining, which Reyes said was the best possible sign. By the third, she was arguing with the meal delivery system, which only offered 2 acceptable options, and she wanted to know why the system didn't include a third. Ethan told her the system was not a negotiation. She filed this feedback with the expression of someone who intended to revisit it. He brought her home on a Sunday afternoon, which was exactly 1 week after the surgery date. Mrs. Calloway had cleaned the apartment and stocked the refrigerator. He'd specifically told her not to do either, and she'd specifically done both anyway. And there were flowers on the kitchen table that Sophie assessed with suspicion before accepting. "How long till I can go back to school?" Sophie asked, sitting carefully on the couch while he fussed with a pillow arrangement she kept moving. 2-3 weeks, depending on how you recover. I'm going to recover fast, she said with total confidence. That's not something you get to decide, he said. She looked at him with the expression that said, you and I both know I'm going to decide it anyway, but said nothing out loud. He worked mornings and was home by early afternoon for the first 2 weeks. He'd rearranged his schedule in ways that cost him money. He didn't love losing, but which was not negotiable. He sat on the couch with her while she read. He made the meals she requested, which were specific and occasionally bizarre. She progressed from the couch to careful walks to the end of the block and back, and he walked beside her without hovering, which took effort, and she pretended not to notice the effort, which took its own. It was during this period, the weeks after the surgery, while Sophie was recovering and the city was tipping from late summer into the first suggestion of fall, that things between him and Victoria began to become something he didn't have a clean name for. She'd texted him the day after the surgery, a number he didn't recognize, a message that said simply, heard from the surgical team that it went well, relieved. Victoria. He'd stared at it for a moment, added her contact, and replied, She's good. Thank you. Simple. That was all. But then she'd texted again 4 days later, asking how Sophie was recovering, and he'd answered that, and then the conversation had continued past that answer into other territory, but nothing significant, nothing that would look like anything written down, just the kind of back and forth that meant something specifically because of how it kept going. She texted the way she talked, direct, minimal filler, genuinely responsive to what he'd actually said rather than to some parallel version of it. He found himself checking his phone, which was not something he typically did. He met her for coffee twice in the 2 weeks Sophie was home before school, once at the hospital cafeteria during a service call he had in the afternoon, once at a place on Brennan Street that she'd mentioned in passing and which he'd suggested without thinking about it too hard. They sat in the window booth and it was raining again, which seemed to be how things went between them, and they talked for an hour and a half about things that were not Sophie, and not the hospital, and not either of their specific situations, just the texture of things, the city, her opinions about architecture, his actual experience of the storm season, a lengthy and surprisingly passionate disagreement about whether cold coffee was an acceptable beverage which she lost on the merits. He walked her to her car after. It was still raining. They stood under his jacket for about 30 seconds while she found her keys. He'd held it over both of them without thinking and then was briefly aware of having done it, and she found the keys and looked up at him, and the distance was closer than it had been. Nothing happened. They said goodnight. He drove home. He sat in the truck in the parking lot of his building for about 10 minutes. He was not someone who dated. He'd tried, twice, in the years after Sophie's mother left, and both times had ended with the specific awkwardness of a man whose entire life was structured around a child, and whose remaining emotional bandwidth after the day was done was honestly limited. He wasn't broken about that. He understood himself well enough to know what he had to offer and what he didn't, and he'd made a quiet accommodation with the version of his life that didn't include someone. This felt different. He couldn't explain why in any way that didn't sound like something a person said when they were already in the middle of something. He went inside. The thing that changed everything happened on a Tuesday, on a morning he'd had no particular reason to expect. Sophie was back at school, 2.5 weeks post-surgery, cleared by Reyes with some restrictions, thrilled to be back in the building even though she'd complained about school enthusiastically for the previous 2 years. Ethan had a commercial call on the west side that finished by 11, and on his way back he swung past the hospital to drop off some warranty paperwork for the VAV unit he'd replaced. The facilities office needed it for their records, and he'd forgotten it twice already. He was in the facilities office for 6 minutes, dropped the paperwork with Bob Petrie, and was heading back down the main corridor toward the exit when he heard his name. Not his name used to him. His name used about him. He was passing the partially open door of a conference room, one of the mid-floor administrative meeting rooms he'd been in once for a facilities review. And he heard a male voice, clipped and precise, say, "Mercer situation sets a bad precedent. Whatever the intent, you've now created a situation where the hospital owner is personally connected to a patient's case, and that's—" Ethan stopped. He didn't mean to. He just stopped, 1 foot forward, the way you stop when something you weren't listening for suddenly has your name in it. A second voice, younger, female, not Victoria, said something he couldn't hear. The first voice again, Leonard something. He thought he'd heard the name once in a hallway. "I'm not questioning the foundation, I'm questioning the optics." Victoria Langford, personal net worth in the billions, personally writes a handwritten note to a specific patient's father, the same man she's been, a pause, meeting with socially. The board's exposure here if it ever becomes a story. Ethan stood in the corridor. He heard the words in order, Victoria Langford, personal net worth in the billions, and the order in which they arrived mattered. He'd heard her name before in passing, he thought, somewhere, but the specific combination of that name with that phrase was new, and the new thing it created in his understanding was not gradual. It was immediate. He stood there another few seconds. Nobody came out of the room. The voice continued, but he stopped parsing the words. Victoria Langford. He'd never looked her up. He hadn't had a reason to. He'd known her as a woman in a rainstorm, and then as someone who worked the administrative side of the hospital, and then as someone he talked to and thought about more than was strictly proportional. The way she'd answered questions. The way she talked about resources and systems and making things work better. The way she'd said, "I oversee operational direction." He walked to the exit, got in his truck, and pulled out his phone. He typed her name, Victoria Langford. The results loaded. He sat in the parking lot for a long time. Forbes profile. Business Insider piece from 3 years ago. Victoria Langford, 27, youngest woman to independently acquire a multi-hospital network. A Millhaven Business Journal article from 18 months ago, Langford Capital acquires Millhaven Children's Medical Center. A photograph, a press event. She was standing at a podium in a conference room, and she looked like herself except armored in a way she didn't look when she was sitting across from him in a hospital cafeteria. Net worth. Estimated 2.1 to 2.4 billion, depending on source. Acquisition portfolio spanning 3 cities. Based in New York, currently overseeing the Millhaven acquisition personally. He put the phone face down on the passenger seat. He looked at the windshield. The lot was busy. Mid-morning hospital traffic, staff coming and going, a woman loading a stroller into a minivan, a delivery truck double-parked near the service entrance. He thought about the note, the handwritten note on plain paper. This isn't charity, it's a program. He thought it was someone in the foundation office who'd understood something about him, who'd taken the trouble. He thought about Victoria asking, "How do you feel about it?" when he'd mentioned the financial side getting sorted. He thought about the way she'd said, "I think it's going to be okay" to Sophie without flinching, the way you said things when you weren't just being kind, but when you actually knew. He thought about every conversation, about the way she'd described her work, making things work better than they currently do, finding systems that are failing, and how he'd said that's basically what I do, and she'd laughed. About the way she'd answered Sophie's questions with the same level of seriousness she answered his. About the coffee on Brennan Street and the rain and his jacket and the 30 seconds they'd stood close enough that he'd felt it. He thought about all of it from the new position of knowing what she was, or rather, knowing what she had and hadn't told him. He drove away without going back inside. She knew something was wrong before he said anything. She was in her office, the one she kept on the second floor of the hospital, not the suite at Meridian Tower, the smaller one with the view of the parking lot, when Marcus knocked and said Ethan Mercer was at the main entrance asking to speak with her. She went still for just a second. "Send him up," she said. She stood up from her desk while she waited. She didn't pace, but she moved to the window and stood there, and the parking lot was doing its ordinary thing outside, and she was aware in a very specific way that a conversation she'd been not quite postponing was about to happen. He knocked on the open door. She turned. He looked the same. Work clothes, same worn jacket, same quality of presence that didn't take up more space than it needed. But his expression was different. Not angry, not cold, just closed in a way it hadn't been before, and she knew that closure immediately. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. He didn't sit down. She didn't suggest it. "I heard your name in a meeting room," he said. "Your full name, with some context I hadn't had before." She nodded slowly. "So I looked you up," he said, "which I probably should have done a while ago." "You had no reason to," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." He looked at her steadily. "You own this hospital?" "Yes." "You've owned it for 18 months?" "Yes." He was quiet for a second. "The note," he said. "The handwritten one. With Sophie's approval letter." She held his gaze. "Yes." Something moved in his face, not surprise because she could tell he'd already worked that out on the way up, but the confirmation of it landing differently than the theory. "How long have you known about her case?" "The night you drove me home," she said. "I saw the hospital letterhead in your truck. I looked up the name that night." He looked at her for a long moment. "You looked up my daughter's medical file." "I have access. As the owner, legally." She said it without hiding behind the legality. "I used access I wasn't supposed to use personally. I know that." "And then you started, what, following her case from your office?" "Yes." "And the foundation?" "The foundation was already something I'd been thinking about," she said, "for months before the storm. The Mercer case made me accelerate it, not create it." "That's true." She paused. "The distinction matters to me. I'm not sure it matters to you right now." "No," he said. "It doesn't right now." He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "I told you things. About Sophie. About her surgery. About other things. And the whole time you already knew." "Not everything," she said. "A file tells you facts. You told me things I couldn't have read anywhere." That's not the point." His voice was still even, but the evenness was costing him something. She could hear it. You knew who I was, and I didn't know who you were. That's not a small thing. No, she said. It's not. Then why? He asked it without heat, which was somehow harder to meet than anger would have been. Not the legal access, not the foundation. Why didn't you tell me when we kept running into each other, when we were sitting in that cafeteria? Why didn't you just say who you were? She could have given him the structural answer, the professional boundary, the habit of privacy she'd built over years of being a name in business pages. All of it was true. None of it was the whole truth. Because when you drove me home that night, you treated me like a person, she said. Not like a resource. Not like a problem. You treated me like someone standing in the rain. She stopped. I spend most of my life being Victoria Langford in the specific way that means something to people before they've said hello to me. Boardrooms, investment meetings, every interaction already shaped by what I have and what I represent. She looked at him directly. With you, I was just a person in your truck, and I didn't want to give that up. I know that was selfish. I'm not defending it. He looked at her. She could see him processing it. Not looking for holes in it, just holding it. That's honest, he said finally. I try to be, she said, and then heard herself saying what she'd said to him in the cafeteria and felt the particular sting of it. He exhaled slowly. The foundation, he said. Was she the reason? She was the reason I moved faster, Victoria said. She wasn't the reason I moved. The hospital has 300 families a year in her situation. That's real. That's the foundation. She paused. But I'm not going to tell you her case didn't affect me. That would be the first thing I've said to you that was an actual lie. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she didn't try to fill it. I feel like an idiot, he said. You're not, she said. You had no information I didn't choose to give you. That's what I mean, he said. I was doing the thing where He stopped, started again. I thought I knew what this was. Between us. I thought I was reading it right. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was more honest than she deserved. Was I? She held his gaze. Yes, she said. You were reading it right? He looked away. Out the window. At the parking lot she'd been looking at before he came in. I need to think, he said. Okay, she said. I'm not... He paused. I'm not saying I know what I think. I'm saying I don't know yet. I understand. He turned to go. At the door he stopped, didn't turn all the way back. Did you, when you saw Sophie in the cafeteria, when you talked to her, that was real, she said. That was entirely real. He nodded, a small downward motion, and left. She stood at the window and listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor, and when the sound was gone, she sat down in her chair and put her face briefly in her hands. Not crying, just holding the specific weight of having told the truth completely for the first time, and having it land exactly as heavy as she'd known it would. What? The board called an emergency session on a Thursday, 11 days after Ethan walked out of her office. She'd known it was coming. Leonard had been telegraphing it through Marcus for a week with the coded language of someone who wanted her to know he was building toward something without giving her the chance to get ahead of it. She sat at the head of the table in the same chair she always sat in and let Gerald Haas go through his presentation, which was longer this time and more organized, which meant he'd been preparing it for a while. The short version, 3 major institutional investors were expressing concern about the foundation's impact on the hospital's financial positioning. 2 of them had requested meetings specifically, not with the board, with her. One of them, a firm called Aldrin Capital, had sent a formal letter through their legal team suggesting that the $35 million endowment commitment, combined with management decisions prioritizing patient welfare metrics over operational sustainability, represented a shift in investment thesis that warranted review. Gerald read the letter with the careful enunciation of someone who'd written most of it himself. She was pretty sure he'd written most of it himself. What they're asking, Leonard summarized, leaning forward, is whether your personal commitment to the foundation is going to continue to influence operational decisions in ways that affect the return profile of their investment. Yes, she said. Leonard blinked. Yes, it will, or yes, that's what they're asking. Both, she said. The foundation influences how this hospital operates. That's not a side effect, it's a design feature. The hospital exists to treat children. The foundation exists to make sure money isn't the reason children don't get treated. Those two things are aligned, not in conflict. Victoria, Gerald, walk me through the Q2 operating numbers. A pause. Gerald looked at his folder. Revenues up 4% over prior year. Operating margins slightly compressed due to admissions, she said, up 7%. Patient satisfaction scores, up. He said it slightly grudgingly. Staff retention, improved. Turnover down about 12%. And what do improved retention numbers mean for per-hire training costs? A longer pause. They go down. And when you factor the reduction in training and recruitment costs against the margin compression from expanded assistance program costs, what does the net look like? Gerald looked at his spreadsheet. He was good enough with numbers to know when they weren't cooperating with his narrative. Relatively neutral, he said. Right. She looked around the table. The foundation is not bleeding this hospital. It's changing who we serve and how we serve them, which is driving the admission numbers and the retention numbers and the reputation numbers, which will matter when this institution needs to recruit talent, attract research partnerships, or negotiate with payers. She let that sit for a second. I understand the investor's concern. I will meet with both firms. But I'm not going to sit across from them and suggest the foundation is negotiable because it's not. Leonard folded his hands on the table. He was not a stupid man, she'd give him that. And if they withdraw? Then they withdraw, she said, and we find capital that understands what this hospital is. The room went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when she said something final. Brenda Cho was looking at her notepad. She looked up. For what it's worth, she said, the foundation has already received 42 applications in its first 3 weeks of operation. 29 have been approved. Silence. 29 families, Victoria said, in 3 weeks. Nobody argued with the 29 families. The meeting ended without resolution, which meant it ended in her favor, because resolution was what the other side needed, and she didn't. She walked out with Marcus at her shoulder, already queuing up the investor meeting requests. She was not fine. She was operating at a particular kind of cost that she didn't discuss with people, the cost of being the one who held the position while everything pushed back. It was familiar. She'd been doing it since she was 22, but it was not free, and the thing with Ethan had taken something from her reserves that she hadn't anticipated. She missed him. That was the plain truth of it, and she was not the type to dress plain truths in better clothes. She missed him specifically, the way he talked, the way he listened, the way he sat across from her and treated her like a person in the room rather than a position in the room. She missed Sophie, which surprised her even more. The directness of that child, the marine mammal taxonomy, the single nod of confirmation. She had made her choices, and she was clear-eyed about them, and she was not going to call him. That was a line she'd drawn before she knew what it was going to cost her. She was 5 days from calling him anyway when he called first. She was in the car on the way back from the Aldrin Capital meeting, which had gone as well as she'd expected, which was not well, when her phone rang and the display said Ethan Mercer, and she looked at it for one full ring before answering. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. A pause. Short enough that it wasn't uncomfortable, long enough that she understood it was measured. "Sophie wants to know if you'd come to the park on Saturday," he said. "She found a pond with actual ducks. She's been researching duck behavior, and she wants someone else to witness it." Victoria looked out the car window at the city going by. Her throat did something she didn't quite have control over. "What time?" she said. 10, he said. "She wakes up at 7 and gets impatient." "That tracks," Victoria said. "Yeah." Another pause. His voice when he continued was slightly different, but not softer, just more careful. "I've been thinking about everything you said." "And?" "I think I understand it," he said. "I don't think I'm completely fine with all of it yet, but I think I understand it." He paused. "You could have paid for Sophie's surgery individually, quietly, In 24 hours. Yes, she said. You didn't? No. Why? She had thought about how to say this, had worked it out in her head over the 11 days since he'd left her office, and she said it the way it was true rather than the way it sounded best. Because paying for your daughter's surgery wouldn't have changed anything for the family whose daughter comes in next month, or the one after. It would have been a transaction, private, invisible, and over. She looked at the city. You deserve better than a transaction. So does every family in that waiting room. A long silence on the line, not empty. She could hear him breathing, could almost hear him thinking. Okay, he said. It was the same word Sophie used when something had been confirmed. Okay, she said. Yeah, he said. Saturday, 10 o'clock. Sophie will brief you on duck behavior, and you'll need to take it seriously because she will absolutely know if you're not. I can do that, Victoria said. She's going to ask you hard questions, he said. She does that. I know, Victoria said. I'll answer them. She hung up and sat in the back of the car for the rest of the drive without looking at her phone, watching Millhaven go by outside the window. The resurfacing project on Granger Avenue still not finished. The Sunoco station, the Vietnamese place, the dry cleaner perpetually going out of business. She thought about a little girl with a marine mammal book and a yellow sweater, and a heart that had been repaired and was now beating steadily on its own, as it was supposed to. She thought about a man who'd stopped in the rain for no reason, except that not stopping would have been the worst thing. She looked out at the city she'd come to without intending to stay, and she thought, not for the first time, some things are worth the inconvenience of getting there. The park Sophie had found was called Alderman Park, which was not a particularly inspired name for a place that turned out to be genuinely good. It was on the east side of Millhaven, the kind of neighborhood that had been industrial once and was now something in between. Renovated brick buildings next to empty lots, a coffee roaster that had been there 30 years next to a gallery that had been there 6 months. The park itself was maybe 3 blocks wide, with actual trees that had been there long enough to mean something, a path that looped around a central pond, and, as Sophie had reported, ducks. Ethan got there at 9:53. Sophie had been ready since 9:15 and had spent the intervening time at the kitchen window watching the street with the patience of someone who had very little patience but was exercising it on principle. Victoria arrived at 10:02, which was close enough. She was wearing jeans and a dark jacket, no blazer, hair down. He noticed this the way you notice when something familiar shifts register slightly. She looked like herself, but a different version of herself. Less armored. He wasn't sure if that was the clothes or the park or something else. Sophie was at the pond's edge before either of them reached it, already crouched down at the water with the focus of a scientist in the field. There were 6 ducks. She had apparently already named them, because when Ethan arrived beside her, she pointed and said, "That one's Gerald. He's the dominant male. And the one by the reeds is Margot. She's the most interesting." "Why is Margot the most interesting?" Victoria asked, coming up on Sophie's other side. Sophie looked up briefly, registered Victoria's presence with a small nod that served as both greeting and acknowledgement that she'd been expected, and looked back at the pond. "Because Gerald thinks he's in charge, but Margot actually decides where they go." "Watch." They watched. After about 40 seconds, Margot turned and walked along the bank toward the far side of the pond, and Gerald followed, and then one by one, the other 4 followed Gerald, and the whole group relocated. "Huh," Victoria said. "Gerald thinks it was his idea," Sophie said, standing up and brushing her knees. It wasn't. Ethan looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Ethan. Neither of them said anything. They walked the path around the pond, Sophie slightly ahead with the book she'd brought. A different one, Waterfowl Behavior, which she'd gotten from the library specifically for today. Reading passages aloud when she deemed them relevant, which was frequently. Ethan walked beside Victoria with the easy distance of people who've established they don't need to fill space. "How's the recovery going?" Victoria asked, quietly enough that Sophie, 10 feet ahead, wasn't pulled out of her duck research. "Better every day," he said. "She's been back at school 2 weeks. Her energy's almost back. Reyes says the valve is functioning normally." He paused. "She slept straight through last Tuesday night, which was the first time in years. Her heart wasn't waking her up anymore." He said it simply, No performance to it, the way he said things that meant a lot without dressing them up. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "That's good," she said. 2 words, both meaning more than 2 words could carry. "Yeah," he said. They walked. Sophie stopped to crouch by the water again where Margot had settled near a cluster of reeds, watching with the intensity that she brought to anything she'd decided was worth bringing it to. "She loves this," Victoria said. "The duck specifically, or the having a thing?" "Both, I think." She glanced at him. "She's lucky she has both." He looked at his daughter at the water's edge. "Yeah," he said. "The morning did what mornings in parks do when nobody's trying to make them into something. It just moved." Sophie eventually ran out of duck observations and pivoted to asking Victoria questions, which she did without preamble or social warm-up, the way she always approached things she was curious about. "What did you study?" she asked, sitting on a bench between them, book in her lap. "Finance, mostly," Victoria said. "Economics. Business strategy." She paused. "I was going to study architecture first." Sophie looked at her. "Why didn't you?" "I got partway through the first year and realized I was better at understanding how systems worked than how buildings worked, and that there were systems that really needed someone to fix them." She shrugged, one shoulder. "It seemed more urgent." "Do you regret it?" Sophie asked. She asked it the way children ask things they've heard adults dance around, directly, without the social cushion. Victoria considered it. "Sometimes," she said. "I see a building I like, and I wonder what it would have been like to have made it. But then I think about the work I actually do, and I don't think I'd trade." She paused. "What about you? What are you going to study?" "Marine biology," Sophie said, with the certainty of someone who had decided this and closed the question. "Specifically, social behavior in marine mammals. Otters and seals mostly, but I'm expanding my scope." "Expanding your scope?" Ethan said. "It's a phrase," Sophie said. "I know what it is." "Dr. Reyes says she can start swimming again in 4 weeks," Sophie said, switching topics with no transition, which was also something she did. "I want to go to the coast." "Can we go to the coast?" Ethan looked at her. "The coast. It doesn't have to be a big coast, just a coast, where there's actual ocean." "We'll see," he said, which Sophie correctly identified as a not yet rather than a no, and which was about as much as he was prepared to commit to on a Saturday morning in a park. "Victoria," Sophie said, "have you been to the coast?" "Many times," Victoria said. "Which one?" "Pacific mostly. Oregon, Washington, some Northern California." Sophie's eyes lit in the way they lit when a topic intersected with her research. "Have you seen sea otters? Wild ones?" "Once," Victoria said, "off the coast of Monterey. There was a raft of them, maybe a dozen, floating in the kelp." Sophie looked at her with an expression that was close to reverence. "Were they holding hands?" "Some of them," Victoria said. Sophie sat with that for a moment, like someone receiving confirmation of a long-held belief. "I want to see that," she said quietly. "You will," Victoria said. Sophie looked at her. "How do you know?" "Because you're the kind of person who decides to see things and then sees them," Victoria said. "I can tell." Sophie seemed to accept this as a reasonable basis for certainty. She opened her book again and went back to reading, and Ethan looked at Victoria over Sophie's bent head, and she was already looking at him, and there was something between them in that look that neither of them named, but both of them understood. They walked Sophie home at noon, and Mrs. Calloway was making something that smelled like soup, and Sophie disappeared inside with the energy of someone who had accomplished a successful field study and now required food. Ethan stood on the sidewalk with Victoria in the early October chill, cars going by, the neighborhood doing its Saturday thing. "Thank you," he said, "for coming." "I wanted to," she said. He put his hands in his jacket pockets. He looked at the sidewalk, then at her. "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it the same way you answer everything else." "Okay," she said. "Is this, whatever this is between us, is it something you'd choose if the hospital weren't in the picture? If you didn't know who Sophie was? If I was just someone you'd met?" She held his gaze without flinching. "Yes," she said. Unambiguously. He nodded slowly. Same question back, she said. Knowing who I am now, the whole picture. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the $2.3 billion and the boardrooms and the Forbes profile and the way she'd been in his truck in the rain, still unperformative, letting the silence be. He thought about the cafeteria and the Brennan Street coffee place and his jacket over both of them in the rain and the 30 seconds of distance that hadn't become anything yet. Yes, he said, knowing the whole picture. She let out a breath, small, barely audible, like something she'd been holding. Okay, she said. I'm still going to be bad at this, he said. I don't have a lot of practice and I have a kid and my schedule is what it is and I'm probably going to say the wrong thing sometimes. I know, she said. I keep things from people reflexively and I work too much and I'm better at fixing systems than being in them. So, we're both great at this, he said. She laughed. The surprised one, the real one. Exceptional, she said. He smiled. It was not a perfect moment. The wind came off the street at the wrong angle and his nose was cold and a car alarm went off somewhere on the next block and the sidewalk needed repaving. None of that was the wrong version of it. It was just what it was. Dinner, he said. When Sophie's at Mrs. Calloway's. This week if you can. Yes, she said. No deliberation. He nodded. She walked to her car, a black sedan, not flashy, which he noted without surprise. And he watched until she pulled out of the spot and then went upstairs, where Sophie was already telling Mrs. Calloway about Margot the duck and the nature of structural power in waterfowl communities. The investor meeting with Aldrin Capital happened on a Wednesday in a conference room in their downtown Millhaven office that was designed to make people feel like guests. Victoria knew the design. She'd used it herself in other rooms. 3 people across the table, the regional managing director, a man named Preston Walsh, who had the careful energy of someone who'd been told to be careful, a woman named Singh, who did nothing but take notes and occasionally ask questions that sounded soft but weren't, and an attorney present in the background in the way attorneys at these meetings were always present, like a specific kind of weather. Walsh opened by thanking her for coming, which she acknowledged. Then he walked through Aldrin's concerns, which were essentially the same concerns Gerald had presented at the board meeting with better visual aids. She let him finish. Preston, she said, what's your return expectation for the Millhaven Children's investment? He gave a number conservatively. What was the return profile when Aldrin invested? He looked at his notes, gave a range. And what are the current projections, accounting for the increased admission numbers and the retention improvements and the payer renegotiation we completed last quarter? A pause. His number was slightly higher than his initial expectation. So the foundation hasn't hurt the return profile, she said. Not yet, Walsh said. The concern is forward-looking. If the assistance program expands, which you've indicated it will, and if that expansion pulls from, the foundation is endowed, she said. $35 million in a separate legal entity with independent investment oversight. It does not touch the hospital's operating budget. Expansion of the program is funded from endowment returns, not from hospital revenues. She paused. I want to make sure Aldrin's team has the correct structural information, because some of these concerns suggest the structure may not be fully understood. Walsh looked at Singh. Singh was writing. The concern is also reputational, Walsh said. If it becomes known that the hospital owner has a personal connection to a specific patient, I want to stop you there, Victoria said. Calmly, no edge. I have access to every patient file in this hospital as the legal owner of record. I've reviewed files in the course of understanding the program I was building. If Aldrin is suggesting that my awareness of the population I was designing a program for represents inappropriate conduct, I'd want to understand the specific concern in writing, because that's a significant allegation. Walsh blinked. And if Aldrin's concern is that I'm too personally invested in this hospital's mission, she continued, then I would say, yes, that's accurate. I think that's what makes me a good steward of it. She looked at him directly. What I'm not going to do is run this institution at arm's length from the people it exists to serve. That's not a negotiation. The meeting went on for another 40 minutes. It did not end in resolution. Aldrin said they would review internally. She said she looked forward to their conclusions. She shook hands with everyone, collected nothing from the table because she'd brought nothing, and left. In the elevator down, she pressed her palms against the wall and breathed. Marcus was waiting in the lobby. "How'd it go?" "They'll stay," she said. "They don't want the optics of pulling out of a children's hospital investment. They'll find a way to be comfortable with it." "And if they don't?" "Then we have a conversation I've already prepared for." She walked through the lobby door into the October air. "What's next?" "Gerald wants a meeting about Q4 projections. He can have 30 minutes on Friday." She buttoned her jacket against the wind. "And Brenda Cho asked if you could get me for 20 minutes today. Foundation update. Something about the outreach numbers." "Good something or bad something?" She said good. She also smiled when she said it, which is unusual for Brenda, so I think it's genuinely good. It was genuinely good. Brenda caught her in the hallway outside the cafeteria at 2:15, holding a folder the way Brenda held all folders. Like the information inside was slightly sacred. 61 applications in the first 5 weeks, Brenda said. 53 approved. We're running above initial projections. What's holding up the other 8? Documentation gaps, mostly. Families not knowing what paperwork they need. We're working on a navigation support position. Someone who helps families through the application before they submit, so the incomplete application rate comes down. She paused. That's actually what I wanted to flag. We need budget approval for the position. Approved, Victoria said. Put it in the next staffing request. Brenda made a note. The other thing, she looked at her folder. One of the approved families, a woman named Teresa Garza, 2 kids, one with a neurological condition, she asked if she could write a letter to whoever created the foundation. She held out a handwritten envelope. I didn't give her a name, just said I'd pass it along. Victoria took the envelope. She didn't open it in the hallway. She opened it that evening in her office, alone, after the last meeting had cleared. The letter was 2 pages, handwritten in careful cursive on lined paper, and it was not dramatic or over-formal. It was a mother explaining what it had felt like to sit in a waiting room knowing that her son needed a procedure that was possible, and that the only thing standing between him and the procedure was a number. She wrote about the specific quality of that particular helplessness. Not the kind where nothing can be done, but the kind where something can be done and you just can't reach it. She wrote about what it meant when that gap was closed. She wrote, I don't know who you are, but I want you to know that my son smiled at me yesterday. He's not in pain anymore. I don't have a better way to say what that means. Victoria sat with the letter for a long time. She thought about the boardroom, about Walsh and his forward-looking concerns, about Gerald and his margin compression, about Leonard and his optics. She thought about all of it, and then she set it against Teresa Garza's 2 pages on lined paper, and there was no contest between those 2 weights. She folded the letter back into its envelope and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, close. November came in fast that year, the way it sometimes did in Mill Haven. Temperature dropping in the space of a week, trees going suddenly bare, the quality of the light shifting toward the shorter days. The city pulled inward the way it did seasonally, less time outside, more time in. Ethan noticed it in his work, more heating calls, more emergency service requests as old systems revealed their winter intentions. He was busy in the way he'd been busy all year, but the quality of it was different now. He worked without the specific dread underneath. He came home without the folder in the second drawer pulling at him through the wall. Sophie was, by any reasonable metric, fine. Better than fine. She had the energy of a kid who'd been running at a deficit for years and was now catching up, not hyperactive, but present in a fuller way, louder in the apartment, more demanding of his attention in the evening in the ways that kids were demanding when they felt secure. He let himself complain about it occasionally to Danny Okafor, who said, Man, that sounds terrible. Do you want me to take the burden of your extremely alive daughter off your hands? And Ethan said no. He had dinner with Victoria on Thursdays, when Sophie was with Mrs. Calloway. Not every Thursday. Some weeks work swallowed the time, and once she'd been in New York for 3 days for investor meetings that couldn't be rescheduled, but most Thursdays. They had a place they went on Cedar Street, a small Italian restaurant that was not trying to be more than it was. that had decent wine and good bread and tables that were just the right distance from each other. It was not a romantic restaurant in the deliberate sense. It was just a good restaurant that had become, without ceremony, their restaurant. He learned things about her in the way you learn things about people across tables over time. Not in revelations, but in accumulation. She hated losing track of things and compensated with systems. Her own folders, her own notebooks, parallel to what Marcus managed. She had an apartment in New York she'd owned for 8 years and had been in, by her own estimate, less than 60 nights total. She had a complicated relationship with her parents, who were alive and not hostile, but who had never quite understood what she'd built or how, and who expressed pride in ways that felt adjacent to the real thing without quite landing. She'd had 2 relationships in her adult life that she described with the unsentimental clarity of someone who'd processed them fully. One that ended because the man couldn't tolerate the specific version of her that existed at work, and one that ended because she'd let the work take too much and come back to find the relationship had quietly given up on her. "You blame yourself for that one," he said, on a Thursday in November, bread in his hand. "I was gone more than I was there," she said. "That's not complicated. You were building something. That's not an excuse, it's a reason. They're not the same thing." She said it the way she said things she'd already worked out completely. "I don't think I handled it badly. I just think I chose the work every time there was a choice, and eventually there weren't any choices left." She looked at her wine. "I don't know if I'd do it differently. The work mattered, but I'm aware of what it cost." He looked at her. "You're very clear about yourself." "I've had to be," she said. "When you're making decisions that affect a lot of people, you can't afford to be confused about your own motivations. Most people in your position tell themselves good stories instead. Most people in my position have better PR than self-awareness," she said. "I'd rather know the truth about my own decisions than feel good about them." He looked at her across the table and thought, "I understand you, not completely." He didn't think you got to completely, not with anyone worth the effort, but enough. The shape of her made sense to him in a way that the contents of his life didn't always make sense to themselves. "Sophie asked about you today," he said. "What did she ask?" "Whether you were coming to her school's winter assembly." He paused. "I told her I didn't know. She said to ask you." Victoria looked at him. "When is it?" "Second week of December." "I'll be there," she said. He nodded. He ate the bread. He didn't make anything out of it, just let it be what it was. A woman saying she'd show up for something, and a man believing her. The Foundation's first formal board meeting, separate from the hospital board, its own governance structure, happened on a Thursday in mid-November in a small conference room at the hospital that Brenda Cho had quietly claimed for the purpose. 7 board members. Brenda, 2 independent community representatives, a pediatric medicine specialist from the university, a family advocate who worked in Millhaven's social services system, the Foundation's legal counsel, and Victoria as chair. Gerald Haas was not on this board, which had been a deliberate structural choice in which he'd registered without comment. The operating update was good. 79 applications in 7 weeks, 68 approved, 11 in process. The navigation support position, the person who helped families understand the application before submitting, had been posted and interviewed, and they were hiring. Outreach efforts through the hospital's social work team had increased application volume by 30% in the 3rd week. The family advocate, a woman named Rosario, said something that stuck with Victoria for a long time after the meeting. The families who need this most are often the least likely to ask for it, not because they don't qualify, not because they don't know it exists, but because asking feels like admitting something they're not ready to admit. She said it matter-of-factly, the way someone says things they've observed across years of work. The navigation support is good, but we should also think about how the program is framed when it's offered. Not charity, not assistance, but something that's just part of how the hospital operates. Like it's normal to provide this, because it should be. It should be, Victoria said. The language in the outreach material still says financial assistance program, Rosario said. Families hear that and they hear charity. What if it just said hospital foundation coverage or foundation care supplement? Something that sounds like a hospital service, which is what it is. Victoria looked at Brenda. Can we revise the materials? This week, Brenda said. It was a small thing, a language change in a pamphlet. But Victoria had learned, across years of working in systems, that language was where the real architecture lived. What you called something determined whether people could reach it. After the meeting, standing in the corridor, Rosario said to her quietly, "How did you know to build it this way? The endowment structure, the separate governance. Most people would have done a discretionary fund." "A discretionary fund lasts until the next budget cycle," Victoria said. "This lasts past me." Rosario looked at her. "Is that the goal? Past you?" "The goal is 300 families a year," Victoria said. "And next year, more. However long that takes." Rosario nodded. "Okay," she said, with a small smile that was somehow both professional and warm. "Good." Victoria drove back to Meridian Tower that evening, thinking about language and permanence and the specific version of ambition that isn't about what you accumulate, but about what you leave standing. She thought about Teresa Garza's letter in her inside jacket pocket, which she'd been carrying with her the way you carry things that remind you what you're doing when the doing gets hard. She thought about Ethan, the way he talked about HVAC. "I like that there's always an answer. It's either working or it's not." She thought about systems, about what it meant to fix something properly versus patch it. He'd been doing that his whole life without the vocabulary for it, and she'd been doing it with every resource available and hadn't always done it better. She pulled up to Meridian Tower and sat in the car for a moment before going in. November rain on the windshield. She had a memory, sudden and specific, of standing in that rain on Granger and Tilden, the bus shelter doing nothing, her phone dead, and then headlights pulling up and a window rolling down, and a man's voice saying it's raining as if it were the simplest possible argument. She had not been a person who accepted rides from strangers. She was not, technically, someone who should have gotten into that truck. She had done it anyway, and she had not been able to explain to herself exactly why, except that there was something in his voice that was without calculation. He wasn't being kind to get something. He was being kind because not being kind would have been worse. She understood now what she hadn't that night. That was unusual. That was actually genuinely unusual. She got out of the car and went inside. Come. The dinner on the last Thursday of November was different from the others, not in its structure but in its weight. Sophie had been at a school friend's for the evening, a first, a real sleepover, which Ethan had approved with the careful nonchalance of a man who had spent 40 minutes deciding whether she was ready. And so the evening had none of the usual time pressure, no pickup to get back for. They stayed at the restaurant past 9, which they hadn't done before. At some point, between the main course and the coffee neither of them particularly needed, Ethan said something that had been in the back of his mind for weeks. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him across the table. "When Sophie was sick, when the money situation was what it was, I got very good at being alone with it," he said. "I had to. There wasn't another option. You manage the thing you have to manage, and you don't let yourself think about what it would be like to not manage it alone." He paused. "I forgot what it felt like to have someone in the room." She was quiet, not looking away. "It's not the same as before," he said. "I'm not going back to what I was before, and I don't want to. But you're the first person in a long time who's made me think about what the room could look like differently." He stopped. He was not someone who said things like this, and he was aware of that, and he was saying it anyway. "I don't know what I'm saying exactly." "I think you do," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I do." She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, hands folded. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him from the beginning, without performance, without the particular kind of management he'd learned to expect from people who were being careful around him. "I've been thinking about staying," she said, "in Millhaven. Not indefinitely. The portfolio is what it is, and that's not changing, but as a base. Here, instead of New York." He looked at her. He didn't react immediately, which she'd learned meant he was actually thinking. "Because of the hospital?" he said. "Partly," she said. "The hospital needs more oversight than I can provide remotely, and the foundation is in its first year, and I want to be hands-on with that." She held his gaze. "And partly not because of the hospital." He nodded slowly. "You don't have to say anything about that," she said. I know, he said. He was quiet for a moment. Sophie's going to be annoying about it. Victoria blinked. Annoying how? She's going to be smug, he said. She's been smug since the park. She has this look she gets when she thinks she knew something before the adults did. Victoria thought about Sophie and the ducks and Margot. She smiled despite herself. She probably did know, she said. Yeah, he said. She usually does. He paid the check and they walked out into the cold November night, and outside the restaurant he put his hand in hers the same way he'd done everything else, without ceremony, just because it was what the moment was. She held it the same way. They stood there a second on the sidewalk, Cedar Street quiet around them, the restaurant's window throwing warm light out onto the pavement. Dinner next Thursday? He said. Yes, she said. He walked her to her car, and she drove away, and he walked back to his truck, and Millhaven did its November thing all around him, cold and unremarkable and entirely real, and he drove home to a quiet apartment with his daughter's whale drawing on the refrigerator and the whiteboard in the kitchen with the date crossed off, and he sat at the kitchen table for a while in the good kind of quiet, the kind that didn't have anything pressing in it, and he thought, this is what it feels like when the weight lifts. Not gone, just different. Just the right weight now, carried the right way, by enough people that the carrying was possible. He didn't try to name it more than that. Some things worked better unnamed, held just as they were, without needing a cleaner story than the one that was true. The folder was still in the second drawer. It would probably always be there. He was not someone who threw things away. But it was just a folder now. Paper, ink, a record of something that had been survived. He left it where it was and went to bed. December came to Millhaven the way December always did, without apology, dropping the temperature 12 degrees in a week, and turning the streets gray and stripping the last of the leaves from the trees along Granger Avenue so that the branches stood against the sky like something honest, like things that had stopped pretending to be more than they were. Sophie declared it her favorite month, which surprised Ethan because she'd declared October her favorite month 6 weeks earlier. When he pointed this out, she said, "People evolve, Dad," with the tone of someone who found the observation beneath her, and he let it go. She was different now, in ways that accumulated slowly, the way changes in children always did. Not dramatic, not sudden, but one morning you looked at them and the person you saw was not quite the same as the person from 6 months ago, and you couldn't find the exact point where one became the other. She was louder in the apartment. She argued more, which Reyes had actually mentioned might happen. Something about the body having more resources now, energy that had been quietly rationed for years suddenly available. She slept through the night regularly. She ate more. She ran in the parking lot behind their building on the weekends. Not far, not fast, but she ran. And Ethan stood at the kitchen window and watched her, and felt something he couldn't name moving through him like weather. She had also become, since the park, since the ducks, since the dinner on Cedar Street that she'd extracted a full debriefing about the following Sunday, increasingly proprietorial about Victoria. Not possessively, Sophie wasn't possessive by nature, but in the way she asked about her, the way she included her in plans she announced rather than proposed, the way she'd started saying we should ask Victoria about things that had no particular reason to involve Victoria, except that Sophie had decided they should. She asked if Victoria could come to the winter assembly, Ethan told Victoria on the phone one evening in late November. You told me, Victoria said. I'm telling you again because she asked again. I said I'd be there. She wants you to sit with us, not in the back. With us. A pause. Okay. She's going to make you hold a program and clap at the right times. I can do that. She'll know if you're clapping at the wrong times. Ethan, Victoria said, I'll clap at the right times. He smiled at his kitchen wall. Okay, he said, just warning you. Noted, she said, and he could hear that she was smiling too, which was a thing he'd gotten good at hearing. The winter assembly was on a Thursday evening, which worked out, and Victoria was there at 6:15 when it started, sitting in the third row of the school gymnasium between Ethan and Mrs. Calloway, who shook Victoria's hand with the specific warmth of a woman who had decided something in the span of the handshake and would not be revisiting it. Sophie was in the fourth grade group, wearing the navy dress she'd negotiated for specifically because it had pockets, and she found them in the audience before the program started and made brief eye contact with Victoria with an expression that could only be described as satisfied. The assembly was the kind of school event that was earnest and slightly too long and entirely worth it. Sophie's class sang 2 songs, one of which she clearly knew better than the other. She clapped at the right times. So did Victoria. Mrs. Calloway cried at the second song, which was about winter and home and was, objectively, a lot for a Thursday evening in a gymnasium. Afterward, in the parking lot, Sophie walked between them on the way to the car and said, without looking at either of them, "This was good. We should do this more." "School assemblies?" Ethan said. "Things," Sophie said, "together, as a group." Ethan looked across the top of Sophie's head at Victoria, who was looking at the parking lot with the expression she wore when she was holding something carefully. "Yeah," he said, "we probably should." Sophie nodded once, the confirming nod, and got in the truck. The Foundation's first public announcement came out in the second week of December, timed deliberately. Brenda Cho had suggested the timing with the quiet, strategic intelligence she brought to everything, understanding that a story about children and medical care landed differently in December than in August. Not because the need was different, but because people were more open to hearing it. The Millhaven Business Journal ran it first, then the local news picked it up. The story was accurate and fairly reported. Millhaven Children's Medical Center, under the ownership of Victoria Langford, had established a permanent charitable foundation with an initial endowment of $35 million to cover out-of-pocket medical costs for families unable to afford pediatric care. In its first 7 weeks of operation, the foundation had approved 68 cases representing an estimated $1.2 million in family cost relief. Applications were open and proactively offered to all qualifying families. Victoria did not give interviews. She'd discussed this with Marcus and with Brenda in advance. The story should be the program, not the person, and the moment it became a profile piece about a billionaire's generosity, it would shift in a way that made her uncomfortable and that, more practically, obscured the thing that actually mattered. Brenda handled the press inquiries with her characteristic combination of warmth and immovability, and the coverage stayed mostly on the foundation and its reach. There was, however, one interview, not for the press. The hospital's community relations office had been building a short documentary about the foundation, 10 minutes, intended for the hospital's website and for a presentation at a fundraising event in the spring. They asked Victoria to participate. She agreed on the condition that the focus remain on the program's structure and impact rather than on her personally. The interviewer agreed, then asked her, in the middle of the shoot, what had prompted the foundation specifically, what had happened to make her move faster than planned. She sat with the question for a moment. "I gave a ride to someone in the rain," she said, "and I saw something in his truck that made me understand the gap between what this hospital could do and what it was actually doing. And I thought, that gap shouldn't exist. It's not inevitable. It's a choice, and you can make a different choice." The interviewer asked what she'd seen in the truck. "A photograph of his daughter," she said, "and a hospital bill." They left it at that. The documentary ran 4 minutes shorter than planned and was, in Brenda's assessment, better for it. Ethan didn't see the documentary until January, when Sophie found it on the hospital's website and played it on the kitchen laptop while he was making dinner. He stood at the stove and listened to Victoria's voice describing the foundation's structure, the endowment, the eligibility criteria. Then he heard her say the part about the rain and the truck and the photograph, and he turned the burner down and stood very still. Sophie was watching the screen. She didn't look at him. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah." "She talked about us." "She talked about the situation," he said. "She didn't use names." Sophie considered this with her head tilted slightly. "She used enough," she said. He looked at the screen. Victoria on camera was composed and clear and slightly different from the Victoria he knew across a dinner table. Not false, just more contained, the way anyone is when a camera is on them. But then she said the thing about the photograph, and her expression shifted very briefly into something he recognized, something that was not for the camera, but that had been caught by it anyway. He turned the burner back up. "Is it okay?" Sophie asked. "That she said it?" "Yeah," he said. "It's okay." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Sophie seemed satisfied. She closed the laptop and set the table, which she'd started doing without being asked since she came home from the hospital. Not every day, not with perfect consistency, but often enough that he'd stopped remarking on it because remarking on it seemed to jinx it. He called Victoria after Sophie was in bed. "I saw the documentary," he said. "I know," she said. "I thought about calling you before it went up." "Why didn't you?" A pause. "I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it, and I didn't want to manage your reaction before you had it." He thought about that. "That's decent of you," he said. "I should have told you," she said. "Not asked permission. It's my story to tell too, but told you." "Yeah," he said. "But I'm not upset. I just—" He stopped. "You put yourself in it." "It's true," she said simply. "You didn't have to." "I know." Her voice was even. "But it's the reason I moved faster, and the program is more honest with that in it than without it." She paused. "And I think I wanted it on record, that it happened that way, that someone stopping in the rain was the thing." He was quiet for a moment. Outside his bedroom window, Millhaven was doing its December thing, cold and quiet, and lit in patches by the streetlights. "Sophie said you used enough," he said. Victoria was quiet for a second, then, "She's something else, your kid." "Yeah," he said. "She really is, Jess." Christmas was the first one in years that didn't have the folder's gravity pulling at everything. He still had it. Still in the second drawer, would probably always be there. But it was historical now, a record of something that no longer had dominion over how the day felt. Sophie wanted a telescope. He got her a telescope. A real one, not a toy. A proper entry-level refractor that had taken more research than he'd anticipated, because Sophie had expressed her requirements with the specificity of someone who had done more research than him, and was going to know if he bought the wrong one. He set it up on Christmas morning in the living room, and she looked through it at the building across the street and declared the resolution acceptable, which was the best review he was going to get. Victoria came for dinner on Christmas evening. Not for Christmas itself. She'd gone to New York the previous week to see her parents, which she'd described on the phone with the particular tone of someone navigating something complicated with practiced competence. But she came for dinner on the evening of the 25th, which Sophie had specifically lobbied for, and she brought wine for Ethan and a book for Sophie that was so precisely correct. A scientific field guide to Pacific marine mammals, the professional researcher's edition, not the children's version, that Sophie had looked at it for a full 10 seconds before saying anything. "How did you know which one?" Sophie said. "I asked Dr. Reyes what reference materials the hospital library had, and then I got you the one they didn't have," Victoria said. Sophie held the book with the reverence she reserved for things that had been taken seriously. "Thank you," she said, which was 2 words from Sophie, but which landed like more. They ate at the kitchen table, which was the right place to eat on a night like that. Not the restaurant, not somewhere considered, just the table with the whiteboard on the wall and the whale drawing on the refrigerator and the telescope in the corner of the living room pointed at the building across the street. Mrs. Calloway had sent food up, more than anyone needed, which was her signature. Victoria had brought dessert. Ethan had made the main dish, which was chili because it was cold, and because Sophie had requested it, and because it was one of about 6 things he made reliably well. After dinner, Sophie set up the telescope at the window and attempted to locate a specific star cluster she'd read about, and Ethan and Victoria sat at the table with the remainder of the wine and the particular quietness of people who didn't need to perform an evening at each other. "How were your parents?" he asked. Victoria turned her glass. "The tell." "Fine," she said. Then, "Complicated. My mother wanted to know about the foundation and kept asking questions that were really about whether I was lonely, and my father wanted to talk about portfolio strategy. And by day 3, I remembered exactly why I spend most of my time somewhere else." She paused. "They love me. I know that. The version of me they love is slightly different from the version that actually exists." "That's most parents," he said. "Is it?" "The ones I know, yeah." He thought about his own, his mother in Cincinnati, his father who'd remarried and moved to Phoenix, both of them proud of him in ways that were real but peripheral. People do their best. Their best is sometimes its own kind of lonely. She looked at him. "That's a generous read." "I've had a lot of time to work on it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. From the window, Sophie made a sound of triumphant discovery. She'd found something through the telescope and was narrating it to no one in particular, the way she sometimes did. "I'm going to stay," Victoria said. Not as a new announcement. They'd discussed it, in the way they discuss things, incrementally and honestly. But this was different, final. "Marcus thinks I'm losing my mind. Leonard Price sent me an extremely diplomatic email about operational efficiency. 2 of my New York advisors are concerned about my strategic focus. And," he said, "and I live here now," she said. "I found an apartment on the riverside of downtown, good light, close to the hospital. I signed the lease last week." He looked at her. He hadn't known about the lease. "Last week," he said. "I was going to tell you at dinner Thursday," she said. "Then Sophie texted me about the telescope and it slipped." "Sophie texted you?" "She has my number," Victoria said. "She asked for it in October." He stared at her. "She has your number." "She uses it responsibly," Victoria said. "Mostly marine mammal updates and occasional logistical information." She held his gaze with the faintest trace of a smile. "She sent me the telescope specifications in November. I think she was providing options." He looked at the telescope in the corner, where Sophie was now attempting to redirect it toward something she'd decided was more interesting. "I didn't know any of that," he said. "I know," Victoria said. "She asked me not to mention it. She said you'd overthink it." He was quiet for a second. Then he started laughing. Not a polished laugh, a real one, surprised out of him. Victoria laughed too, the quick, real version, and for a moment the kitchen was just that. 2 people laughing at a 9-year-old who had been managing them both with the calm efficiency of someone who'd decided how things were going to go and had simply implemented it. "She's terrifying," he said. "She's excellent," Victoria said. "Same thing," he said. The ceremony for the Foundation's official launch, a public event, a proper one with guests and a brief program, was scheduled for the 3rd Saturday in February. Brenda Cho had organized it with the thorough capability she brought to everything, and it was being held in the hospital's main atrium, which had been cleared and arranged with the rows of chairs that marked occasions. The invitations had gone out to Foundation donors, to hospital staff, to the community board, and to the 68 families, now over 110 by February, the numbers having continued to climb, whose cases had been approved. Not everyone came. Some couldn't. Some sent notes. But the atrium filled in the way that spaces fill when the thing happening in them is real. Ethan almost didn't go. Not because he didn't want to. He did. He wanted to be there. But because in the 2 days before, he'd gotten quiet in a way that Victoria had learned to recognize, a retreat into his own thinking that wasn't hostile, but that needed space. She gave him the space and waited. He called her the night before. "I'm coming," he said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't worried. I needed to figure out how I felt about it." "Did you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I feel like a person who stopped in the rain and somehow ended up here," he said, "and I don't fully know how to be in the room for it." "You just be in the room," she said. "That's all it is. You make everything sound simpler than it is." "I make complicated things accurate," she said. "It's different." He thought about that. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." The morning of the ceremony, Sophie was awake before him, which was unusual, and was dressed by the time he got to the kitchen, which was unprecedented. She was wearing the navy dress with the pockets again, and her hair was in the braid she only did on specific occasions. "You're ready," he said. "I've been ready for 40 minutes, she said. "It doesn't start until 10. "I know when it starts," she said. "I want to be there early. Victoria's going to need to do things beforehand, and I want to be there." He looked at his daughter in her navy dress with her braid, already certain about where she was supposed to be. "Give me 20 minutes, he said. 15, she said. He was ready in 16, which he considered a reasonable compromise. The atrium was already filling when they arrived at 9:30. Ethan found them seats, middle section, not front, not back, the right distance from things. And Sophie immediately located Victoria across the room and went to her with the direct navigation of someone who'd decided where they were going. He watched from the seats as Sophie appeared at Victoria's elbow, and Victoria turned, and her expression did the thing it did. Open, immediate, the armor completely down. And she crouched slightly to Sophie's level, the way she'd learned to do rather than talking at her from above. And they had a conversation he couldn't hear that involved Sophie gesturing towards something across the room and Victoria nodding. Brenda Cho appeared at the podium at 10 o'clock exactly, and thanked everyone for coming with the efficient warmth that was entirely her own. The program was not long. They'd been deliberate about that, understanding that a ceremony that went on too long became about the ceremony rather than the thing being marked. There were remarks from a community board member, from the pediatric department head, and from Rosario, the family advocate, who spoke for 4 minutes about what the foundation meant to the families she worked with, and who said, near the end, what this program does is remove the specific cruelty of a world where a child's health depends on the accident of their parents' bank balance. That cruelty is not inevitable. We chose to stop it. The room was quiet in a way that rooms are quiet when something has landed. Then Brenda returned to the podium and said she wanted to share something that had informed the foundation from its beginning. And she described, briefly, no names at first, a conversation the hospital's owner had told her about. A stormy night, a woman stranded at a bus stop, a man who stopped without being asked and gave a ride to a stranger and had a photograph of his daughter clipped to his sun visor and a hospital bill visible in the truck. Ethan felt Sophie's hand find his, which surprised him. She didn't look at him. She was watching the front. Brenda said the man's name. She said Sophie's name. She said that Sophie Mercer's surgery had been the first case approved under what would become the foundation, and that her father's refusal, his insistence that other families might need help more, had been part of what convinced the foundation's creator that a permanent structural solution was the only real answer. "He's here today," Brenda said, "and we'd like him to come up." Ethan did not move immediately. Sophie squeezed his hand. "Go," she said quietly. Not loud enough for anyone else to hear. He looked at her. "Go, Dad," she said. "It's okay." He stood. He walked to the front of the room, a room full of families he didn't know, staff he'd passed in corridors, board members he'd never met, Brenda at the podium who stepped back to give him the microphone with a nod that said, "You don't have to say much, just be here." And he stood there. He was not a public speaker. He had not prepared anything. He gripped the edge of the podium with one hand and looked out at the room and said the only thing he could say, which was the true thing. "I just gave someone a ride home," he said. "That's all I did." He looked at Victoria, who was standing to the side of the room, not at the podium, not in the center. She'd arranged the ceremony that way deliberately, he understood. And she was looking at him with the expression he'd learned was her unguarded one, the one she couldn't manage. "Everything else was her," he said. "And the people in this room, and the families who are going to walk through that door next year and the year after that." He paused. "I just didn't want to drive past someone standing in the rain." He stepped back from the podium. The room applauded. He walked back to Sophie, who moved over to give him his seat, and when he sat down, she leaned against his arm for just a second. Not a dramatic gesture, just contact, just the warmth of her there, the weight of her recovered and real and present. Victoria came to them after. The room had broken into the kind of loose conversation that follows a ceremony when people are ready to talk to each other. She crossed to where they sat, and Sophie stood up and said simply, "Good job," which was high praise from Sophie, and which Victoria received accordingly. "Good job to you too," Victoria said. "You got your dad up there." "Someone had to," Sophie said. Ethan looked at them both. The two of them standing there, neither performing anything for him, just being whoever they were in the same space, and felt something he'd been circling for months finally settle into the place it had been heading. He was not prone to epiphanies. He didn't trust them as a rule, the sudden clarifying moments, because in his experience, most of life's important things arrived gradually, and then you looked back and realized they'd been true for a while before you'd named them. But standing in that atrium in February, with his daughter and this woman and a room full of people whose lives had been changed by something that started with a Ford F-150 and a broken bus shelter, he understood something clearly. Goodness didn't announce itself. It wasn't efficient or cinematic. It was a man too tired to think straight who saw someone in the rain and stopped anyway. It was a woman who could have written a check and instead built something permanent. It was a 9-year-old who managed her own fear to protect her father and still found room to be curious about every living thing that swam in the ocean. It wasn't virtue, exactly. It wasn't heroism. It was just people doing the harder thing when they had the chance to do the easier one. That was all it was. But that was, it turned out, everything. What? Spring came late that year, the way it sometimes did. March still gray, April starting warm, then changing its mind, and then one morning in the second week of May, the temperature settled and the trees came back, and the city's quality of light shifted the way it did seasonally, everything suddenly more visible. Sophie cleared her 6-month post-surgical checkup with results that made Reyes use the word excellent twice in the same sentence, which Ethan noted because Reyes was not a word repeater. Her valve was functioning correctly. Her development indicators were all normal. She'd caught up on the growth percentile she'd been behind on. She was, by every measure Reyes had, a healthy 10-year-old. "Any questions?" Reyes asked. Sophie, sitting on the examination table with her legs dangling, said, "Can I go in the ocean this summer?" Reyes looked at her chart, looked at her, looked at Ethan, looked back at her. "Ocean swimming," he said. "With supervision, reasonable conditions? Yes. I don't see a reason not to." Sophie looked at Ethan with an expression that contained the words, "I told you." "We'll talk about it," he said. "We're going," she said. "We'll talk." "Dad, we're going." Reyes made a sound that was professionally neutral, but which Ethan suspected was a suppressed laugh. They went. In July, 2 weeks after Sophie turned 10, they drove to the coast. A 6-hour drive that Sophie spent alternating between the Marine Mammal Field Guide and a road trip playlist she'd assembled with the seriousness of a person curating an important archive. Victoria drove part of the way. She and Sophie had a disagreement about optimal coastal geography that lasted from mile marker 47 to mile marker 89, and that Ethan stayed entirely out of, which was the right call. They rented a small house 40 feet from the water, 3 bedrooms. It had a deck that looked at the Pacific, and a kitchen that was slightly too small, and a deck chair with a broken armrest that nobody fixed because it was the one they all kept sitting in anyway. Sophie swam on the second day. She went in with the careful incrementalism of someone who'd been told to ease in, and then she was in, and she was swimming, and Ethan stood at the waterline with his feet in the cold Pacific and watched her in a way that he couldn't have watched her doing anything 6 months ago, without the specific undercurrent of fear, just watching, just his daughter in the water. Victoria stood beside him. "She's doing it," she said. "Yeah," he said. Sophie came up from a wave laughing, hair plastered to her face, and she looked at them on the shore with the expression she sometimes had when she thought no one was watching. Wide open, younger than she usually let herself look, a kid who was just happy. She waved. Both of them waved back. "I want to see otters," Sophie called from the water. "Tomorrow," Victoria called back. "You said that yesterday." "I meant it yesterday too. Tomorrow." Sophie went back under a wave, apparently satisfied. Ethan looked out at the water. He thought about the distance between that Tuesday evening in the rain and this. The 2 points on a map that had no obvious connection, that you could only understand as connected in retrospect, after the path between them had been walked. He thought about all the small choices that had made the path. Stopping the truck, the note on plain paper, the coffee in the cafeteria, the park, the dinner, the ceremony in February, 6 hours in a car on a road that ended here. None of those choices had been certain. None of them had come with a guarantee. He'd made them the way he made most decisions, with incomplete information in the direction of what seemed honest, without knowing what was on the other side. That was, he supposed, the only way it worked. You didn't get to know ahead of time. You just had to decide what kind of person you were going to be when the moment arrived, and then be that person and see what it made. "She's really something," Victoria said. She wasn't looking at Ethan. She was watching Sophie in the water. "Yeah," he said. "I mean that in a—" She paused. "I didn't think I'd feel like this, about any of this. I wasn't planning for any of this." "I know," he said. "It doesn't scare you," she said. "That none of it was planned?" He thought about it honestly because she always deserved honesty. "The scariest version of my life," he said, was the one where I was managing everything perfectly and Sophie still wasn't going to be okay. That was planned. I had the spreadsheets and the payment schedule and the whole thing. He looked at the water. This is better. She looked at him. He looked back. Yeah, she said. It is. Sophie came out of the water 20 minutes later, slightly blue-lipped and completely satisfied. She wrapped herself in the towel Ethan held out and said, I saw something. Under the water. I think it might have been a seal. Might have been, Ethan said. It was definitely a seal, she said. I'm going to look it up. You're going to warm up first. I can do both, she said, already heading toward the house. Sophie. I'm warming up, she called back, which was not exactly true, but was close enough. They followed her up the beach toward the house. Ethan, Victoria, the sound of the water behind them, and the late afternoon light coming off the Pacific in long, flat lines. The broken deck chair waiting on the porch, dinner needing to be figured out, a 10-year-old already inside arguing with a field guide about seal identification. Nothing about it was perfect. His back hurt from the car ride. Victoria had 3 unanswered emails from Marcus she was going to have to deal with eventually. The house's shower had inconsistent water pressure, and the kitchen was genuinely too small. These were the actual conditions. This was the actual version. And this was the word, the only accurate one, enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that you spent a long time not believing was possible. And then one day you looked around and realized you were already in the middle of it. He held the door for her, and she went in and he followed. And the door closed behind him, and the sound of the ocean continued outside, steady and indifferent and permanent, the way the ocean always was. Not caring about any of it, not keeping track, just there, doing what it did, which was more than enough. Inside, Sophie said, It was definitely a harbor seal. Dad, I was right. It says right here. Show me, he said, and she did.